I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 676, Burning Eastern Europe 4. Yannick's eyes widened. He shouted in fear, and then subconsciously pulled the trigger. Bang. The bullet flew up into the sky. Krzysztof had already started to reload, but he heard Yannick still muttering randomly, "Virgin Mary, please bless your." He patted him hard on the back. "Stop talking nonsense. Reload quickly, reload." Yes, reload. Yannick's hands trembled even more, and it took him a long time to take off the gunpowder bag, but he could not pour it into the gun. Even after trembling for a long time, he really longed to be able to go to the battlefield and kill the invaders, but at this time he couldn't control his body no matter what. The more he told himself to stop shaking, the more his limbs shook, and not just the limbs. He even felt that his stomach was violently spasming, as if an invisible hand was stirring his internal organs, making him almost out of breath. And in his mind, he could not stop imagining the scene where he was shot by the Russians, just like Petrovich just now. "Aim shooting." The voice of the company commander came. Yannick took a deep breath, crossed himself on his chest, then reluctantly poured the gunpowder into the gun and spilled most of it. Drasovitz reminds everyone to aim before hitting. The Russians in front of him were getting closer. The flying bullets are getting denser and denser. Wails could be heard from time to time in Yannick's infantry line, and then someone would fall down, and then the soldiers from the rear would step forward, drag the body away, and then hold themselves against the vacant spot. Yannick pulled out the purge and tried several times before inserting it into the muzzle of the gun accurately, and there was another volley of fire all around. Bang, bang, bang. The gunfire from the opposite side suddenly woke him up. When he looked up, he saw that the Russians had rushed to less than 40 steps in front of the parapet. He could even see the beard on the face of the guy opposite. He finally loaded the ammunition, raised the gun, aimed at the man, and pulled the trigger hard, but the gun did not go off. He hurriedly lowered his head to check, only to find that the flint clamp had not been opened. "Damn it. I'm such a stupid ass," Yannick muttered, pulled the gun with difficulty, raised the gun again, and saw the bearded Russian also aiming at him. He was excited and subconsciously bent down to avoid it, shooting. The Polish army fired another volley, but Yannick was whipped by the officer. "Stand up, coward." At this time, a dozen Russian soldiers had already ran 20 steps away, shouting randomly and shooting at them with guns seemingly influenced by Yannick. More and more Polish soldiers huddled under the parapet. The Russians immediately took advantage of the situation and sprinted for a while. The bearded man even jumped onto the parapet and stabbed Drasovitz with a bayonet. The latter raised his flintlock forcefully, and the cold bayonet drew against his scalp. The Russian immediately raised his foot and kicked him in the face. Drasovitz groaned and bent down. Krzysztof, the only recruit among the recruits who was still shooting, shouted anxiously, stand up and shoot." The surrounding soldiers were still huddled there, and no one responded. Even Drasovitz, a veteran, was squatting there with his face covered. "Damn it. Have you all forgotten that girl from yesterday?" Krzysztof shouted. "If the Russians are allowed to break through the defense line, all Poles will be like her." Yes, he still doesn't know the girl's name. After she died, the little boy named Kachi didn't say a word. "Damn it. Keep shooting. This place can't become another Livonia." Krzysztof's voice stopped abruptly. Yannick was startled, turned around and saw that a large piece of Krzysztof's neck was torn open by a bullet, and blood was spurting out from the breach, spraying all over the Russian soldiers in front of Drasovitz. "All over my face, Krzysztof," Yannick shouted, suddenly remembering that there was still ammunition in his gun. His arm suddenly gained strength, and he raised his gun and shot at the Russian soldier. Bang. The bearded Russian was still wiping the blood from his face when a hole was punched in his abdomen. After shaking twice, he fell from the parapet. Yannick shouted, swung his flintlock gun, and knocked over another Russian who had climbed up the parapet. The officer's order rang in his ears again. "Prepare, yes, shoot." Yannick quickly stood up the flintlock gun and began to pour gunpowder into the muzzle point. What flashed before his eyes was the girl who was hit by the cannon yesterday, Batrovich, whose head was smashed, and Krzysztof, whose blood spurted out. For a moment, his hands seemed to have forgotten to tremble. Yannick quickly completed the reloading, took a deep breath, then raised the gun and roared like a beast. Damn. Russians can die too. I just killed one. I'm going to kill another fucking one. Dratsovitz also calmed down. He shook his head and reluctantly raised the gun. I have to hold on here. My Melina and Fyodor are in the warren. I have to stay in front of them, perhaps. Krzysztof's words just now had an effect, or perhaps he was inspired by Yannick's heroic performance. The recruits huddled nearby stood up one after another, shooting following the officer's order. The Polish army's position in the village of Zagazig fired the neatest salvo since the battle. A dense barrage of bullets swept past, and the Russian soldiers at the front fell down in an instant. On a mound 3 kilometers away. In front of the Russian temporary command post, General Morkov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian-Polish front, looked at the sparse fire on the Polish defense line through the telescope, and the Russian scattered soldiers who were almost rushing into the village of Zagazig, and a disdainful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Note 1. His Majesty the Tsar should have declared war long ago, and there was no need to assemble these 120,000 troops. He handed the telescope to the staff officer beside him. The combat effectiveness of these Polish troops is almost as weak as that of the Ottomans. Yes, he just sent a group of exploratory scattered soldiers and almost broke through the Polish defense line, which gave him a clearer understanding of the strength of the Polish army. He signaled to the herald, let Władysław withdraw. Korolev will launch a general attack in an hour. Today, I will push the front line to the city of Moscow. Yes, General. Morkov was not arrogant. As the main offensive direction of this war of conquest, he had a full 75,000 troops under his command, and he brought as many as 92 cannons alone, which was why the Polish position was bombarded so badly. And this army had participated in the Russo-Turkish War, and its combat quality was much higher than that of the Poles. On the other hand, Poland had only 50,000 soldiers, and no more than 30 cannons. If he still couldn't win a quick victory, he wouldn't have to go back to St. Petersburg. Soon, a gong sounded behind the Russian army, and the attacking Russian skirmishers immediately began to retreat in an orderly manner until the Russians had withdrawn from the range of the flintlock. The Polish officer shouted stop, and Yannick put away the flintlock belatedly. In the open space in front of him, there were at least 60 or 70 Russian bodies lying in a mess. Yannick was stunned for a moment, and suddenly felt a hot current surging from his back to the top of his head. He waved his arms uncontrollably and shouted, "We beat back the Russians. They ran away. They ran away." The surrounding recruits were also stunned for a moment, and then jumped and cheered. "The Russians have retreated. Haha, let them know how powerful we are. Long live Poland. Long live the motherland." Note 1. The Russian army that invaded Poland was divided into two parts, the Lithuanian front in the north and the Polish front in the south. It does not mean that the army was composed of Polish soldiers. Chapter 677 Burning Eastern Europe 5. Everyone can't relax yet. Dratsovitz waved his hand and said loudly, "That was just a test by the Russians, and the real battle will come later." However, because his left cheek was severely swollen, his voice was somewhat muffled, and no one paid attention to him for a while. Dratsovitz became anxious and climbed up the parapet. Just as he was about to continue shouting, he saw the company commander coming over, patted him on the shoulder, shook his head and said, "Let everyone have fun. It will be so easy in the future. There will be less and less. Their company's mission is to hold on to the village of Zagazig for 3 days. So far, only 3 hours have passed. The soldiers celebrated for a while, and then began to collect the bodies and treat the wounded. Father Stashuk, who was in charge of Drasovitz's company, came and stood in front of each fallen soldier, and said a brief prayer for them. The company commander hurried over and said anxiously, "Father Stashuk, you shouldn't come now. The Russians will attack at any time. It's too dangerous here." The priest waved his hands calmly. "I must bring the comfort of the Lord to the young men." By the time he and his assistant finished praying for all 41 fallen soldiers on the Zagazig village defense line, and rushed to the next defense point. The sound of Russian bugles could be heard in the distance. The priest turned back, raised his wrinkled hands, and shouted loudly, "Brave crusaders, God is with you." A burst of warm cheers suddenly broke out on the battlefield. Drasovitz squinted at the Russian soldiers pouring out of the woods ahead, his brows frowning more and more. There are at least 1,300 people, or even more. Immediately, the voice of a ranger reporting to the officer was vaguely heard in the distance. The Russians are gathering. An infantry regiment is the center. There are also skirmishers. About a battalion, on the north side of the village, traces of Russian cavalry. Drasovitz spat hard on the ground and said with a gloomy face, "There are really enough of these Russian bastards. 1 regiment plus 1 skirmisher camp, that's at least 2,000 people. There are also cavalry. There were less than 1,400 Polish troops responsible for defending the village of Zagazig. Yannick had been replaced by another recruit. He remembered that his name seemed to be Jerzy Rachko, so he turned his head and said, "Hello, Jerzy, are you here?" "Yeah. We met at the training camp, right? You guys were really awesome just now." "Yeah. A lot of people died. Are you nervous?" "No." Rachko puffed up his chest. "I'm so excited." Yannick nodded. "Keep your hands from shaking. This is very important. Also, the Russians are nothing. They'll die if you get shot. So shoot them as quickly as possible." "Okay, I get it." The Russian artillery began to fire, which was suppressive fire, before launching an attack point behind the parapet on the east side of Zagazig village. Polish soldiers stood upright, gritting their teeth, and ignoring the whizzing shells. Occasionally someone would be shattered by a cannonball, and others would immediately fill up. Still standing tall and tall. Not long after, the sound of the Russian military drums faintly appeared. Drasovitz whispered to the recruits on both sides, "Hold on, as long as we survive this wave, we may be able to hold on for 3 days." He knew very well that the first round of the offensive team's attack was the most ferocious. But if a breakthrough is not achieved, the momentum of the Russian army will be frustrated. And the recruits on their side will also become numb from the initial panic, numb to the sound of gunfire, artillery and death. This line of defense will be stronger as a result. As the drumbeat became clearer and louder, a Russian infantry column appeared in Drasovitz's field of vision. The column was 3 lines wide, followed by more than 10 rows of soldiers, hunched over and trotting over. This is the most popular offensive method among European powers in recent years. Drasovitz knew that on the wide battlefield, there should be more than a dozen such columns attacking at the same time. Behind the column was the infantry line. If you are entangled by the Russian assault column, the infantry line on the opposite side will take the opportunity to get closer and use the numerical advantage to defeat you. It would be nice if there were a lot of cannons, he muttered in his mind, and heard the officer's voice. "Get ready." Yannick next to him quickly raised his flintlock gun, a few minutes faster than him. Drasovitz smiled and whispered, "One more, our crusader. Mission intensive." Tongues of fire spurted out from the Polish defense line, and more than a dozen Russians who approached immediately fell down. Rachko patted Yannick on the back hard and said excitedly, "I hit it. Did you see it? I hit it." The latter glared at him. "Quickly reload." Immediately, the Polish army fired several consecutive rounds of salvos, but the Russian infantry was also extremely fierce. Although people were being shot and killed, they were still advancing. Yannick had no idea how many times he had finished reloading. When he raised his gun, he saw that the Russians had stopped and were approaching more than 30 steps away. "Shoot!" the officer's order came, and Yannick hurriedly pulled the trigger. He glanced to the side and saw that Lachiko was still struggling to reload. Bang, bang, bang. The Russians fired back almost at the same time. The bullets crossed each other coldly, and the soldiers on both sides groaned in succession, and blood splashed everywhere. The Russians' reloading speed was obviously faster than that of the Polish recruits. With a burst of gunfire, several Polish soldiers who were still reloading were hit. "Hold on. Yannick and Drasovitz shouted together they had lost one person on each side, but the other Polish soldiers seemed not to see it, and just raised their guns firmly. Volley. Several Russian soldiers were also killed, and they immediately fired back with a volley. The soldiers of both sides continued to harvest each other's lives at a very close distance, and at the same time, they also put their own lives on the gambling table. The wailing and screaming covered the entire battlefield, even drowning out the sound of gunfire and military drums. Blood and limbs flew everywhere, but were soon covered by new blood and corpses. Life was like the cheapest weeds, falling down in clusters under the smoke. Yeri, reload. Yannick raised his gun and turned his head to remind him, but he saw that the face on the right had been replaced by another person. He was stunned for half a second, wiped his face with his elbow, not knowing whether it was sweat or blood, and shouted to the recruit, "Carol, keep your hands from shaking. This is very important. Fire." Yannick roared with the officer, and the flintlock in his hand spewed out flames, and the Russian holding the flag on the opposite side fell down in response. The other Russian soldiers looked at each other, looked at the scattered corpses beside them, and suddenly turned their heads together and retreated. On the battlefields on both sides of the north and south, 7 or 8 Russian columns finally could not bear the casualties and began to turn around and flee. Hey, they retreated. Carol excitedly waved his fist. Yannick nodded and said in a deep voice, "Don't relax, there are still many enemies behind." Sure enough, just a few minutes later, the Russian infantry line appeared in front of everyone. In front of them, there were still 300 or 400 Russian skirmishers who kept suppressing and shooting. Chapter 678 Burning Eastern Europe 6th. The Russian army's firepower was more intensive than that of the Poles, and its shooting accuracy was also higher when their infantry line arrived more than 40 steps in front of the parapet on the east side of Zagazig village. Several gaps had appeared in the Polish army's position. The number of Polish soldiers who were added later has gradually decreased. On the bell tower not far away, a Polish captain put down his telescope and said anxiously to Lieutenant Colonel Lubinska, who was in charge of commanding the defense line of Zagazig village, "Master, with this level of casualties, if we don't send the reserve team up, it will be very difficult. There may be a crash." Lieutenant Colonel Lubinska frowned. He knew that his advisor was right. However, those 300 soldiers were the last strength in his hands. Today is just the first day of the war. If the reserves were also consumed, he would have no choice but to abandon Zagazig village. And his mission is to stay here for 3 days. General Kosciuszko said that the Russian army must be dragged into the rhythm of a critical battle before subsequent combat plans can be implemented. Lubinska took a deep breath and said solemnly, "I believe them." The Russian army's shooting became more and more fierce. In just over 10 minutes, the long and narrow array covering the north and south sides of the village had reached a position more than 30 steps in front of the Polish defense line. "Don't be afraid." Drasovitz's voice was hoarse, but he still shouted, "Behind us is the motherland." This sentence was what he remembered when he listened to a speech by someone from the Bar Alliance last month. He actually listened to a lot that day, but only remembered this sentence. Yes, behind him is the motherland, and even more, so his son and daughter the invaders can't get past him. Unless he dies. The surrounding recruits shouted, "Protect our motherland, fight with them for the motherland." The Russian infantry lines opened fire. The Polish army's defense line was instantly reduced by 20 or 30 people. But the next moment, the Polish soldiers responded with a volley. Although their shooting skills were poor, the Russians also suffered nearly 30 casualties. Although the breast wall is slightly higher than the abdomen of an adult, it can still provide a certain degree of protection. This is also the Polish army's only reliance. The Russian commander was also loudly motivating his men. The numerically superior infantry line has successfully approached the Poles, and the quality of our own soldiers is also much higher. There is no reason why we cannot attack this line of defense. In just 7 or 8 minutes, the two sides had conducted dozens of rounds of shooting face to face. The formations on both sides became uneven. The fierce exchange of fire left them no time to deal with the corpses, and it was difficult to replenish the strength of the rear team. In the command post at the rear of the Russian army, General Morkov observed the Polish defense line through the telescope and said to the staff, "Order the baggage camp to prepare. The village of Zagazig will be ours soon." The attack will begin before 2:30. The town of Maris, that would require a lot of shells. He had clearly seen that the Polish defense had been reduced to at least a fifth. Even the powerful Russian army would collapse in the face of such heavy casualties, let alone the weak Poles. In fact, he already wanted to praise the Polish army. If it were the Ottomans, they should have started surrendering as early as when their infantry line reached 40 steps. Poor Poles, he smiled and shook his head. How long can you hold on? 20 minutes? Or can you wait until Stepashin starts attacking? The fierce exchange of fire in front of the defense line in Zagazig village continues. Polish soldiers were still falling one after another, and those who were still alive were overwhelmed by Russian shooting. However, it was completely different from what Morkov expected. This army, which is mainly composed of new recruits, may be nervous, panicked, or even scared, but no one wants to escape. Their souls have been closely linked by the concept of Polish nation. They are not alone here. They are part of Poland. No one can invade their most cherished motherland. Coupled with the blessing of the Crusaders' belief in jihad, life and death are just the most insignificant matter to them at this moment. What they have to do is to sacrifice their last drop of blood for the great motherland under the watchful eye of God. Even if he is the only one standing behind this parapet, all the senior officers of Dracovitz's company were killed. At this time, he silently chanted the drumbeat in his heart and shouted loudly, "Aim." No one questioned his order, and about 70 people around him raised their flintlock guns at the same time. Emission, Dracovitz's hoarse shouts seemed to penetrate the battlefield, carrying dozens of lead bullets, and hitting the Russian army's line formation, beating 6 people including the drummer to bloody pieces. The Russian officers were shocked to find that, although the Poles suffered heavy casualties, they did not waver at all. On the contrary, some on their side began to retreat. Several Russian company commanders killed 6 or 7 retreating soldiers one after another, and then stabilized the situation. At this moment, a sneer appeared on the face of the Russian infantry commander. He heard the sound of horse hooves coming from the northwest. Look, these bastards are scared. Drasovitz noticed that some Russian soldiers retreated, and immediately encouraged his comrades loudly. At this moment, someone on the left side of the defense line suddenly shouted, "There are cavalry. Be careful." The commander of the nearest infantry company 7 turned his head and looked, and his heart tightened immediately. More than 40 Cossack cavalry sneaked past the northernmost end of the defense line under the cover of skirmishers, and behind the defense line was their own artillery position. Yes, although there were only 2 guns, they had been playing a huge role. In fact, they accounted for at least a quarter of the Russian casualties. Drasovitz was just a soldier, and he didn't know the thrilling containment, feint attack and fighting that had just happened in other parts of the battlefield. But he knew that, although 40 cavalrymen could not shake the infantry line, they could destroy the 2 cannons. The captain of the 7th company drew his sword and shouted loudly, "Follow me to protect the cannons. Only veterans, hurry." Drasovitz immediately ran towards him and waved to Yannick, "Come too." "Okay." The captain of the 7th company led more than 30 veterans to the artillery position. This was the maximum number of people he could mobilize from the defense line. If there were more, the defense line would not be able to hold up. Drasovitz ran desperately, but his heart was filled with despair. He remembered that there were only a dozen guards left at the artillery position. By the time he rushed over, the cannons should have been destroyed by the Cossacks. A quarter of an hour later, the captain of the 7th company led his men to the artillery position, and saw that the artillery was still loading and firing, and he was relieved immediately. "Where are the enemy cavalry?" he shouted to the nearest gunner. "They are blocked over there." The latter raised his hand and pointed to the northeast. The company commander immediately saw that 200 steps away, a small group of people were relying on 2 dilapidated farmhouses and fiercely exchanging fire with the Cossack cavalry. No, the battle there was no longer fierce. The number of people resisting the cavalry was too small, and they had been wiped out. In a flash, only sporadic gunshots came from behind the farmhouse. "Who is there?" The company commander frowned. He knew that with only more than a dozen soldiers guarding the artillery position, it would be impossible to hold off the Cossacks for so long. The gun lowered his head, picked up a cannonball, ran to the muzzle, and said in a low voice, "It's Father Stashak and the Lithuanian and the blacksmith." The army of this era could not do without these craftsmen for a moment. They had to repair boots and guns for the army at any time, and they were precious technical jobs. There were 12 leatherworkers and 10 blacksmiths in the village of Zagazg Point. It was they, together with the priest, who assisted the 14 infantrymen here, and used their lives to hold off the Russian cavalry. For nearly 20 minutes. Chapter 679 Burning Eastern Europe 7. At this moment, the gunfire from the farmhouse in front stopped abruptly. Drassovitz turned his head and saw more than a dozen Russian cavalrymen rushing to the back of the farmhouse from both sides, stabbing the bodies of Father Stashak and others with sabers, not knowing whether they were venting their anger or confirming whether he was dead. Obviously, the other soldiers also saw this scene, and they all clenched their flintlocks tightly. With angry flames in their eyes, "Damn beasts," someone shouted with bloodshot eyes. "Let's go and avenge the priest. Yes, kill these sons of bitches. Come back." Although the captain of the 7th Company was also livid, he stopped the soldiers and shouted, "We must make Father Stashak's death worthwhile. We must defend the cannon." Everyone was silent. Drassovitz gritted his teeth and said, "Sir, what should we do?" The captain quickly looked at the simple artillery position under his feet. This is a small mound with a slightly higher terrain. Except for a tree behind, there is nothing to cover, and the triangular wooden frame used to defend against cavalry was only perfunctorily placed. In other words, the Russian cavalry can attack from several directions. The whistling of the Cossacks came from a distance. The captain glanced at the cannon wheels buried in the soil in order to be more stable when shooting. The gunners often do this and couldn't help frowning. It was too late to move the cannon. He didn't have time to think about it and said to the soldiers, 20 strong men, put on bayonets, form a semicircle, and try to block the cannon. Others, shoot from the inside. Karoslaw, take a few people to move the barricades. He looked at the captain of the artillery again. Let your men pick up guns and come together to resist the cavalry. Yes, sir. But we only have 4 flintlocks. The artillery guns were taken away by Father Staszak and his men. Then, use ramrods, long-handled brushes, whatever. Okay, sir. The Cossack cavalry was very fast, and they almost didn't form a formation, and they whistled and pressed towards the artillery position from the west. Drassovitz's legs were spread out in a lunge, and the butt of the flintlock was clamped at his waist, with the bayonet at the muzzle tilted upward at a 45-degree angle. The veterans around him did not need his reminder, so he turned to Yannick behind him and said, "Hold steady, the range of the cavalry gun is very short. Wait and aim before shooting. You may only have one chance to shoot." Yannick's breathing was very rapid, and he nodded vigorously. "Okay, I remember." Just a few minutes later, the wolf-like Russian cavalry came to 80 or 90 steps away from the artillery position and began to gallop. Generally speaking, when facing the infantry bayonet formation, the cavalry will choose to pass in front of the formation, wait for an opportunity to kill with guns or sabers, and then line up in the distance, turn around and come again. In the repeated harassment, the infantry formation was torn into a gap and then forced to break in from here. However, this time the Russians found that the number of defending infantry was not as many as their own, and because the defense surface was too wide, the infantry was only a thin row, so they decided to charge directly. The rumbling sound of horse hooves struck the heart of every Polish infantryman. Even the most experienced veterans would inevitably feel a strong sense of fear when facing a tall warhorse. But the 20 Polish infantrymen who formed a semicircle were like nails to the ground at this moment. Even though their eyes were wide open, and they even forgot to breathe, they did not move at all. With a loud bang, the cannons surrounded by the Polish soldiers opened fire first. But only one cannon had an angle that could reach the Russians. A large bunch of iron balls suddenly drilled into the cavalry formation and dispersed under the huge momentum, directly piercing 2 horses and 3 Russian cavalrymen. Smoke and dust wrapped in flesh and blood left traces in the cavalry formation. Several artillerymen used wet cloth to cool the barrels as quickly as possible and then loaded gunpowder. However, the Cossack cavalry had already rushed up the mound, and the cavalry guns crackled. Immediately, 2 Polish soldiers fell down, covering their wounds. The captain of the 7th Company kept repeating, Don't shoot, wait a little longer. The cavalry had rushed to a place only 30 steps away from the Polish defense line, and they threw away their guns, and drew their sabers, their main weapons, and rushed forward with strange cries of course, because this was the hinterland of the Polish army, Polish soldiers might come to reinforce at any time, which made them want to fight quickly. Just when Drasovitz could clearly smell the bad breath of the horses, he finally heard the captain's shout, "Shoot!" A row of flames suddenly burst out behind him. The 6 Cossack cavalrymen running in the front fell off their horses and tripped to cavalrymen behind them. Hold on. As soon as the captain roared, Drasovitz felt a lot of sand and gravel coming towards him, and his eyes darkened. It was because the sun was blocked by the warhorse. The common situation in movies where cavalrymen butt heads against infantrymen is impossible to happen. Horses will instinctively stop when facing sharp bayonets. The Cossack cavalrymen on horseback raised their sabers high and chopped them down straight at him. Be careful, the soldier next to him exclaimed loudly, and the bayonet was quickly sent forward. When the saber fell halfway, it was the first to pierce the cavalryman's waist. The Russian screamed and fell off his horse. Thank you. As soon as Drasovitz uttered a word, a saber chopped from the side, and a horrifying wound appeared on the chest of the soldier who had just saved his life. No, blood was about to seep out of Drasovitz's eyes. He shouted and raised his bayonet and rushed towards the Russian cavalry. Behind him, Yannick was holding a flintlock and met a Cossack cavalryman head on. The cavalrymen were much taller than the infantrymen on horseback, and in hand-to-hand combat, it was like an ordinary person fighting a dwarf, but he was not afraid at all. He stabbed the Russian saber at him and stabbed him in the abdomen with his teeth. Not far away, Kiroslaw pounced on a Russian cavalryman, and the two of them pinched each other's necks and rolled down the mound together. The Polish artilleryman in the back row stabbed the horse's neck with a long-handled brush, and the frightened horse threw the cavalryman on its back off. But the next moment, a hand axe suddenly flew from somewhere and nailed him in the forehead with a puff. A Polish soldier with a broken right leg gasped heavily and crawled to the nearest Cossack cavalry. With the last bit of strength, he chopped the horse's leg with a saber he picked up. That was the highest position he could reach. The Russians had never expected that such a loose infantry defense line would not collapse under the full force attack of more than 30 cavalrymen. And it also dragged them into a hellish life-for-life battle. In just over 10 minutes. The slope was covered with corpses. Amid the blood and broken limbs, several horses twisted their bodies impatiently, trying to throw the dead bodies hanging on the stirrups off. Chapter 680 Burning Eastern Europe 8. Yannick's ribs were broken, his thigh was stabbed, and his whole body was as limp as a ball of cotton. He struggled to raise his head and looked at a Cossack cavalryman more than 20 steps away. The other party was obviously unable to move and just kept cursing in Russian. Yannick spat at him and suddenly noticed that an artilleryman lying half on a dead horse in front of him seemed to move. He hurriedly shouted, "Over there, Sergeant, how are you?" The artilleryman slowly turned his head, and after a while he spoke with difficulty. For the time being, he probably won't die. Only then did Yannick see that half of his face was completely rotten, and a piece of flesh hanging on his nose was swinging back and forth as he couldn't breathe. "We seem to be holding on," he said. The artilleryman said in a leaking voice. "Yes, the cannon is still there." Suddenly, his body trembled, and he raised his hand desperately to point to the bottom of the slope, as if he was seeing the entrance to hell. That there. Yannick looked along his arm, and his heart suddenly twitched. He saw that the 2 Russian cavalrymen who had fallen off their horses were still alive, and they were climbing onto their horses at the moment. Gun. Yannick looked around hurriedly and immediately saw a flintlock not far away. Just as he was about to crawl over to pick it up, he heard the artilleryman say, "It's useless. You can kill one at most." Yannick was stunned. In his current state, it is more likely that he will miss none. What to do? What to do? His heart twitched again. They desperately killed all the Russian cavalry. No one was left to fight, but they unexpectedly missed 2 enemies. It only takes 1 Russian soldier to nail the cannon door shut. No, it can't be like this. It can't be. The artilleryman suddenly remembered something and motioned to the cannon behind Yannick. "Look, the muzzle is facing them. I remember that it was filled with gunpowder just now." If you put a grape shot in it and fire when those two bastards get close, you might kill them both. Yes, cannonballs. Yannick lowered his head to search and immediately saw the cannonball box 5 or 6 steps away. He struggled to crawl over, opened it, and looked at the artilleryman. Which one should I use? Grey, wrapped in linen. Okay. Yannick had already heard the sound of horse hooves and hurriedly picked up the linen bag. With this force, a heartbreaking pain immediately came from the broken ribs. His eyes widened, and despite the pain that made him unable to breathe, he desperately took out the cannonball, took a few hard breaths, and dragged the cannonball under the muzzle. The sound of horse hooves came closer. It must be climbing a hill. Yannick shouted, knelt there, and grabbed the cannonball. As he moved, it seemed like a knife was inserted into his chest, stirring constantly. God, please give me strength. He put his neck against the base of his right arm and raised the cannonball above his head, getting closer and closer to the muzzle. Hurry! The artilleryman shouted anxiously. Yannick shouted again, put his left leg on the ground, and slowly stood up. Blood spurted out from the wound on his right leg. The next moment, the cannonball finally slid into the muzzle. He couldn't find the ramrod, so he pushed the shell down with his arm. The artilleryman glanced at the Cossack cavalry, then looked at Yannick. Insert the fuse. Just to the side of the muzzle. Yannick glanced at the gun port and replied, the fuse has been inserted. Then, light the fire. Yannick looked up and saw the ignition rod inserted behind the cannon. He staggered towards it, but suddenly his feet stumbled, and he fell to the ground. Everything around him was spinning, and his last thought was that he must not faint. What are you doing? The artilleryman used too much force, and blood gushed out from his cheek. Light the fire. Quickly light the fire. However, there was no reaction from the infantryman next to the cannon. The two Cossacks had climbed to the top of the breakthrough, and when they saw the unattended cannon, they suddenly saw the helpless beauty lying in front of them. The two of them were about to turn over and dismount, when suddenly, a little brown-haired head appeared on the other side of the slope. A little boy climbed up with difficulty. When he saw the bloody corpses on the ground in front of him, he immediately froze there in fear. If Yannick had not fainted, he would have definitely recognized him as Kachi, the brother of the girl who died in the Russian shell that day. The artilleryman reacted instantly and shouted to the boy, little guy, pick up the smoking stick and light the rope on the cannon. Quick! The boy was startled for a moment and saw Yannick lying next to the cannon. He finally plucked up the courage to walk to the ignition pole and pulled it out. The two Russian cavalrymen seemed to understand what he was going to do and hurriedly turned their horses' heads. However, a horse is much slower than a human when it wants to turn around. Under the guidance of the artillery, Catch placed the burning oilcloth on the fuse. The sparks disappeared into the cannon door with a whoosh, and immediately, the cannon let out an earth-shattering roar. Bang! Catchy was shaken by the huge recoil and fell to the ground. The two Cossack cavalrymen who were only 20 or 30 steps away from the cannon disappeared instantly. Even the two horses had their upper bodies torn off by the cannonballs, and the remaining parts flew towards below the slope. Ha ha ha. The artilleryman laughed twice and was about to praise the child when he suddenly choked on a mouthful of blood. He coughed violently and tilted his head and fell on the horse's corpse. More than 10 minutes later, the artillery in Zagazig village began to pour shells on the Russian line again. The Russian army had just recovered some momentum due to the cessation of shelling, but was immediately beaten back. On the Polish defense line, the positions of Drasowitz and Yannick and others had long been replaced by other soldiers, but like them, they still faced the Russian bullets fearlessly and gave the most fierce counterattack. Finally, the Russian infantry, unable to withstand the huge casualties, began to retreat. The attitude of the Poles on the opposite side, who did not take death seriously at all, left a huge shadow in the hearts of each of them. The Polish soldiers began to climb over the breastwork and chased up with shouts. The Russian army suddenly began to run away like a dog that had lost its home. As Drasowitz said, the offensive momentum of the Russian army was greatly weakened the next day, and the Polish recruits grew up almost overnight and gave them a head-on blow with amazing morale. However, this old soldier will never be able to see this scene. He will never see his marina and fighter again. Perhaps one day, his children will tell their children how their grandfather used his life to block the iron hoof of the Russian cavalry for them. 2 days later, Yannick retreated to the town of Meretz with the troops' regiment. even held out for one day longer than originally planned. On the long Mozzie defense line, battles like the one in Zagazig village can be seen everywhere. The Russian-Polish front, which originally planned to occupy Mozzar in 5 days, has just taken down the first line of defense here. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 681, Prelude to Counterattack. Austria's northeastern border city, now ESZCZ. Nearly 1,000 citizens gathered in the square of the cathedral in the city center, looking at Archbishop Malou, Mr. Mesmer, standing on the stone steps of the church with pious expressions. The new crusade has begun. Mesmer exuded a holy light and raised his hand. All Christians should respond to the call of His Holiness the Pope and head east to the sacred battlefield. Google search TWKA and the evil heretics will be judged there, and you will also atone all your sins. Although the onlookers were not as fanatical as the Poles, they also followed suit and shouted while making the sign of the cross, "Judge the heretics, respond to the holy war." The Bishop of Nowy-Sącz Diocese, Borowski, who was standing behind Archbishop Malou, was pale. The papal envoy had only said that he would convey the Pope's instructions, but he didn't expect such intense content. He wanted to stop it, but he didn't know how to end it in front of everyone. Mesmer continued, if the Russian heretics defeat Poland, they will cross the Carpathian Mountains and take this place for themselves, and you will be forced to pray with 3 funny fingers. Your children will be thrown into a water tank for baptism. There will never be a chance to escape the torture of purgatory. Do you want this? As a professional liar, he naturally knows the importance of exaggeration. The prayer gestures of the Orthodox Church are not mandatory, and baptism is just to immerse the child in holy water, and no water tank is used. As for purgatory, there is no such thing in the Orthodox Church, and there is no need to atone for sins to avoid the suffering of purgatory. But the crowd in the square has already erupted in a tsunami-like shout. No, never. Heretics, don't even think about coming here. Holy war. Holy war. Mesmer nodded with satisfaction. Then, use your piety to support the warriors fighting against heretics. Bishop Borowski almost fainted, rubbing his forehead desperately, thinking about how to eliminate the influence caused by the special envoy. After he left. Suddenly, his eyes fixed. No, for such a big thing as calling for a holy war, why didn't the Holy See issue instructions in advance, but directly sent a special envoy? Just at this moment, Mesmer finished his speech and walked towards him. Bishop Borowski had a gloomy face, hurriedly pulled him into the church and said, "What do you want to do? This is not the Pope's decree." Mesmer was not nervous at all. He was prepared to be exposed before he came, and the other party didn't even doubt his identity, but only suspected his behavior, which was much easier to solve than the previous times. He said calmly, "At the moment, although it's not now, it will be soon." Bishop Borowski said angrily, "How is it possible? I will expose you to the Holy See. This is your right." Mesmer smiled and said, "By the way, you should have heard that Russia has issued an ultimatum to Poland and will soon go to war, so what? All European countries will soon know that the Pope is going to launch a holy war. If Poland does not fight well, the Pope will definitely not deny the existence of the holy war, because that will make the world think that the Holy See is afraid of the Orthodox Church, and if the Poles defeat Russia, then the Pope will have a great prestige because he leads this holy war. In that case, His Holiness the Pope will even come to Nowy-Sącz in person and call on the Crusaders to go to the east." Borowski was startled. It seemed to be true. Everything this papal envoy did was to expand the influence of the Holy See. Mesmer continued, "If you can promote the holy war in the diocese, I will definitely commend you to the Holy See." The reason why he was so calm was that, even if something unexpected happened, the intelligence agency would rescue him immediately. Oh, and the Polish Freedom and Security Committee assisted him. That afternoon, Mesmer left Nowy-Sącz, sent off by Bishop Borowski, and rushed to Belz, Austria, to continue his holy war speech. Not long after, Pamphlets about the Pope's call for holy war began to appear in now ESCZ in larger numbers. Citizens were discussing this everywhere. Then, some religious fanatics really went to Poland to participate in the Crusades. Although the number of people was not large, only more than 100, they basically provided their own weapons and did not need to be paid. Mesmer passed through several cities on the Austrian border and added 700 or 800 soldiers to Poland for nothing. Of course, more important than the number of troops, the news soon reached Vienna, and Austrians knew that the Poles were fighting the Crusades with the Russians as the spear of God. As Austria is a Catholic country, people naturally think that it should stand on the side of Poland. The town of Merek. Janek wiped the flintlock with a rag, calculated silently in his mind, and said to himself, 7 days, this is the 7th day since he came here. That is to say, the Russian army has been blocked outside the town for a week. Although there were news of danger on the defense line every day, and the casualties of the soldiers were very serious, the casualties of his company were close to 1/3. The defense line was never broken by the enemy. A little boy came over with a wooden bucket and began to wash the rag on the ground. Janek looked at him and said, "Kak, there will be a carriage transporting the wounded back to Warsaw tomorrow. You can go with it." The little boy was startled and shook his head. Janek said, "Listen, it's dangerous here." Kachi still shook his head. "You want to avenge your sister?" Kachi nodded. Janek stretched out his hand and rubbed his head, causing a sharp pain in the wound. "Hiss, I know, but you are not as tall as a flintlock gun. I can fire." The little boy rarely spoke, but he said these words very hard. Janek smiled. "Then you have to go back to Warsaw to study mathematics first, and then you can become a qualified artilleryman. The enemy will not always get to the muzzle of the gun by himself." He has decided to adopt the child, even though he is only 19 years old. However, he was officially promoted to sergeant 3 days ago, and the allowance is almost enough for Kaki to attend ordinary school, while military school is said to be free. Kaki looked at him again, thought for a moment, and nodded seriously. "Okay then. I'll be back soon." Yannick subconsciously wanted to rub his head, but suddenly thought of the wound. He quickly retracted his hand and pointed to his feet. "I'll hold this place until you learn how to fire, just like Mr. Drasovitz and the others." The sound of military drums coming from behind interrupted his words. He turned around and saw a Polish army appearing on the road in the distance. The soldiers lined up in an extremely orderly queue and walked south to the beat of drums. The number of soldiers was so large that it stretched to the end of sight. Kachi gave him a questioning look. Yannick shook his head. "Maybe he came to assist the town's defense. I don't know." It happened that the second lieutenant from the company came to check the condition of the firearms. Hearing this, he raised his head and pointed to the military flag at the front of the queue. "That's the King's 3rd Infantry Division, and the one behind seems to be the King's 2nd Cavalry Battalion." Chapter 682. Galloping on the vast plains. If Drasovitz were still alive, he would definitely add in a very proud tone, "This is our most elite unit." He had been in Slavonia for actual combat training for 2 months and was already considered a veteran. The King's 3rd Division had participated in almost all battles against the rebellion and had extremely rich combat experience. Yannick looked at the arrogant soldiers in the distance and said excitedly, "With their participation in the defense, the Russians would never have been able to break into the town of Maris." The second lieutenant on the side shook his head, looking at the direction they are marching. "They probably are not here to help with defense. Then, where are they going?" Beside the formation of the 3rd Infantry Division of the Royal Polish Army, General Kosciuszko was riding a horse, looking at the endless plain ahead, and said to Prince Poniatowski beside him, "With the current status of the soldiers, they can reach Kiev in 4 days." The prince nodded and glanced in the direction of Maris town. "I will stay here until the day after tomorrow." Our boys really shocked me. The city that was originally used to lure the Russian army was supposed to be the city of Moscow. I didn't expect that they actually made the Russians suffer at the first line of defense. Now, one town of Maris is enough to make the Russians desperate. Kosciuszko sighed solemnly, but the casualties are also very high. In more than 10 days of defensive battles, more than 5,000 people on Mosira's side have died. Yes. Prince Poniatowski nodded, recalling the situation during the combat meeting at the French Royal Ordnance Factory that day. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is right. If all the troops are put into defense, it will eventually be defeated. Fail. When he spoke, he had already omitted the word France in front of Crown Prince, making it clear that he meant his own people. Kosciuszko puffed up his chest. I feel more and more that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's plan is the only one that can possibly save Poland. The prince glanced at him and said, I still think it's better for me to go. After all, even if I'm captured, Catherine II will probably let me go. Kosciuszko did not laugh at the idea of being captured before the war started, because he knew very well that there were only two outcomes for him, death in battle or capture point. But he must go. We've already talked about this, and it would be more appropriate for me to go. The prince said nothing more. In order to delay Russia's preparations for war, His Majesty the King went to please the Tsarina alone. Now his reputation in the country is not very good. He has become the only person who can take charge of the overall situation. Also, Kosciuszko is indeed better at commanding this kind of battle that requires adaptability than he is. The two of them walked far away from the town of Maris, and then the prince turned his horse's head and returned. Before leaving, he carefully crossed himself on his chest and said to Kosciuszko, May God bless you. The latter also made a prayer gesture. May God bless Poland. Come back alive. Yeah. You should be more careful, Prince. Poniatowski turned and left without looking back. He was afraid that the soldiers would see his red eyes. Kosciuszko's troops walked for another day, and by the next morning, the army was close to the border of Mozy, walking into a wilderness. Kosciuszko looked into the distance, suddenly stopped, urged his horse onto the mounds beside the road, and waved to the Polish soldiers in front of him. Do you know what's ahead? Everyone stopped to watch. After a while, a captain said, General, if we walk forward for about half a day, we will enter Russia. Russia? Kosciuszko smiled and said loudly, when I was a child, it was still Polish land. The soldiers fell silent for a moment. Kosciuszko continued, you may not know where we are going this time. I can tell you, now that I will take you back to your homeland. We are going to attack Kiev. The soldiers suddenly looked at each other. Mozy's defensive battle was so difficult, but the general wanted to launch a counterattack against Russia. No, against the Polish homeland. Kosciuszko pointed to the town of Maris. Tomorrow, Prince Poniatowski will pretend that he cannot hold on and lure the Russian army to launch a fierce attack on the town of Maris, and we will take advantage of the Russians' attention to attack the Russian supply line in Kiev. We want the invaders to know that the Poles also have bayonets and cannons, and we will not let them bully them. This was Joseph's battle plan for Poland. The Eastern European plains are easy to attack and difficult to defend. If Poland only defends blindly, it will surely fall into a war of attrition with the Russian army. With Poland's national strength, it simply cannot afford to waste it. Therefore, he suggested that the Polish army also use the width of the Great Plains to launch an offensive against the Russians. Russia must have habitually focused on how to capture Poland before, just like it did during the 1 Melon, and would not pay attention to the layout of defenses at all point. And when the Polish army suddenly appeared on Russian territory and galloped wantonly on the plains of Eastern Europe, they would immediately be at a loss. Of course, attacking Kiev is only the first step of the entire plan. It is too close to the main force of the Russian army and there are many garrison troops, so it is not suitable for a general offensive, but it is enough to contain the Mokov army. Afterwards, Kosciuszko will lead his army to dance on the vast plains according to the script given to him by Joseph. The soldiers suddenly burst into wild cheers. Counterattack. Jihad. Let those bastards know how powerful we are. Take back Kiev. They were the most elite troops in Poland, but they could only watch the recruits fighting the enemy while they were left behind by the commander. They had been holding back their anger for a long time and had nowhere to vent. They originally thought they would be sent to defend Warsaw, but they didn't expect to beat the Russians on their own territory. They were ecstatic. Kosciuszko waited for the soldiers to calm down and then waved his hand and said, our mission this time will be very dangerous, and there is almost no possibility of returning alive. But we will win true freedom and dignity for our motherland. The invaders will have to go back home. because of our heroic fight. Are you willing to face death with me? All the soldiers around immediately roared in unison, yes. Outside the town of Maretz Point, the Russian commander-in-chief, Morkov, stood on a barn, holding a telescope, and watching a group of Russian stragglers attack the town center. When there was only one street left to the clock tower, a large group of Poles suddenly appeared on the roofs of the surrounding houses and blocked the intersection with intensive firepower. He suddenly felt a surge of anxiety in his chest. This small town is like a wounded soldier who is barely breathing, but he refuses to close his eyes. Damn it. He raised his hand and signaled to the staff, let the Kiev Grenadiers attack. The clock tower must be captured before noon. Yes, General. The staff was about to leave when he saw a ranger galloping to the bottom of the barn, reining in his horse and shouting, General, our baggage camp was attacked by the Poles in the northern suburbs of Kiev. Chapter 683. The storm is coming. Morkov was obviously a little surprised. He quickly ordered the cavalry to come up and asked, what's the damage? General, the Poles destroyed 5 trucks of grain and barley and 7 ammunition trucks. There were more than 200 casualties in the supply camp. Morkov breathed a sigh of relief and smiled disdainfully. These poor cowards can only carry out this small-scale harassment. The ranger was stunned for a moment and said carefully, General, according to Kiev's reconnaissance, there should be more than 10,000 Polish troops present there. Because of the sudden incident, the Kiev garrison was unable to find out the specific situation of Kosciuszko's department. In fact, the King's 3rd Infantry Division alone has tens of thousands of people. Together with the King's Cavalry Battalion, 5 winged cavalry squadrons, the Warsaw Grenadier Regiment, etc., the total strength reaches 17,000. So many? Morkov couldn't help but narrowed his eyes. What do the Poles want to do? The staff officer on the side said, General, they must have discovered that Mozyry will be lost, so they made a desperate move and planned to disrupt our army's supply and delay the pace of our attack. Morkov nodded slightly. In other words, Mozy's defensive strength will now be very weak. The town of Maris must be captured at all costs today, and the attack on Mozy will begin tomorrow. A Major General standing beside him thought, General, the Poles have been hiding behind the defense line, which has made our army's progress very slow. Now that they have escaped on their own, we can take advantage of this opportunity to eliminate the more than 10,000 enemy troops in Kiev. This is much easier than killing them behind the defense line. After hearing this, Morkov also hesitated. General Suvorov's order to him was to quickly seize the area on the west bank of the Dnieper River and form a pincer offensive against Warsaw with the Lithuanian front. Now that his advance has been much slower than expected, it is rare for the Polish army stationed in Mozy to leave. The top priority should be to seize the opportunity to capture this place. He looked at the Major General. General Smirnov, you lead the Ukrainian army, plus 6 Cossack cavalry squadrons, and cooperate with Colonel Chaparov to hold back the Polish army harassing Kiev. Yes, General. Chaparov is the commander-in-chief of the Kiev garrison. At present, there are nearly 4,000 Russian troops in Kiev. Together with Smirnov's troops, the total strength reaches 15,000, which is enough to entangle the Polish troops deep in Kiev. Morkov looked at the staff officer again. Perdarev, fire all the artillery into the town of Maris. I don't want to go on like this anymore. Yes, General. After we capture Mozy, we will go to Kiev to deal with that little mouse. Prussia. Potsdam. Prince Heinrich walked quickly into the music hall of Sanssouci Palace with an unconcealable smile on his face. He found the figure of William II on the high platform next to the band, hurriedly stepped forward to salute, and then whispered, Your Majesty, Russia has sent troops. The latter immediately showed joy, signaled Prince Heinrich to come to the room next to the hall, and asked impatiently, How's the battle going? The latter took out a report and handed it to him. Your Majesty, Russia's 120,000 strong army launched an attack from Mozyr and Braslav at the same time. The good news is that currently almost all of Poland's forces are concentrated on the Eastern Front, and even Warsaw has less than 3,000 soldiers left. This was the result after Joseph continued to force Poland to divest Prussia's military influence. Historically, there were a large number of Prussian officers in the Polish army, and information such as military mobilization was simply transparent to Prussia. Even now, the Prussians in Poland will continue to send news back to Potsdam, but they are unable to access the core information. William II clenched his fists excitedly and said, "Great, then when do you think it is appropriate for us to send troops? Now? Maybe we can wait and see, Your Majesty." Prince Heinrich said, "After the Russian army consumes more Polish soldiers, we can achieve the goal with fewer troops. This can save us money, a lot of military spending." Prussia's economic situation was originally the worst among the great powers. After the depletion of the Silesian War with Austria, its finances were already very difficult. If it were not for the £300,000 provided by the United Kingdom, it would have been very difficult to maintain the finances from collapse, let alone go to war. Originally, William II planned to invade Poland with 40,000 to 50,000 troops. But now it seems that under Russia's powerful offensive, Prussia's 30,000 troops are probably enough. William II nodded. "Then you can mobilize the army to the border according to the appropriate scale. This time we must obtain the entire Greater Poland area, and, most importantly, Gdansk." Wielkopolska refers to the provinces in the westernmost part of Poland, from Sieradz to Poznan. It is a very rich area of Poland. "Yes, Your Majesty, Prince." Heinrich bowed slightly, thought of something again, and hesitated. "There is one more thing, Your Majesty." "Speak, dear uncle." "Catholics in provinces such as Kulm and Napo have shown a tendency to sympathize with Poland. You know, whether we send troops to Poznan or attack Gdansk, we must start from these places. Although the state religion of Prussia is Protestantism, the three provinces of Kulm, Inowroclaw and Naklo in the east are Catholic territories. They were just snatched from Poland during the imperialist war and the religion has not yet been reversed. The so-called sympathy for Poland is naturally also the credit of Mesmer, although he did not directly enter the three provinces of Prussia to preach the Crusades. He gave many speeches calling for holy wars in the neighboring Poznan. The news easily spread to the three provinces, where many residents speak Polish. William II frowned, and said to Prince Heinrich, "Let the secret police get rid of the instigators. I don't want to hear that the dispatch of troops will be affected by this." "Yes, Your Majesty, I will definitely handle it properly." Austria. Vienna. In Schönbrunn Palace, Franz II waved his hand impatiently at Count Reinfels. "I don't want to see him. Please find a way to get rid of that guy." The guy the Holy Roman Emperor was referring to was Count Szczesny Potocki, the Polish foreign minister. He came to ask Austria to send troops to help Poland resist the Russian invasion. According to Austria's consistent policy, it is to protect the territorial integrity of Poland. But this time Franz II planned to sit at the table and participate in this feast. He looked at the Minister of State next to him, Baron Thugut. "How is the troop mobilization going?" The latter immediately said, "Your Majesty, 8 Royal German Infantry regiments, as well as the Kremskorps and the Royal Vienna Cavalry Regiment, a total of 24,000 soldiers have arrived in Nowitzki." Chapter 684 Holy Alliance, Eliminate Heretics. Franz II looked at the Minister of State in surprise. "Why are there only more than 20,000 people? Is this what the military committee meant?" It's no wonder that he asked this question. You know, Austria used 40,000 troops to suppress the rebellion in Slavonia, but only sent 24,000 troops to the national war against Poland. Baron Turgot was a little embarrassed. "Your Majesty, if our target is only the lesser Poland area, these troops should be enough. You know, our financial situation." Franz II heard this and waved his hand impatiently. In fact, Austria's financial situation at this time was not much better than Prussia's. It also experienced the consumption of the Silesian War and had fought a battle in the southern Netherlands before. Although the battle mainly relied on the French army, the logistics were borne by Austria. At present, the rebellion in Serbia has not been completely quelled. The empire has been bleeding everywhere in the past few years. In addition, the southern German market faced competition from France, and the income dropped sharply, and the treasury was already in turmoil. This is also the reason why Francis II was eager to tear a piece of meat from Poland to recover. However, the huge military expenditure pressure forced the empire to send more than 20,000 troops. to attack Poland. Baron Turgot continued, Your Majesty, Russia has attracted most of the Polish troops. The war committee judged that we will not encounter too many obstacles. As he was speaking, he saw the emperor's attendant coming over. Franz II looked at his attendant and said, What's the matter, Your Majesty? Count Schmalz, Marquis Androsch and some nobles have requested an audience. What do they want? Count Schmalz seems to have mentioned that he would obey the call of the Holy See and send troops to participate in the Holy War. The Holy Roman Emperor's face turned green and he shouted, What Holy War? That's just a rumor from the Poles. Tell them not to mention it again. Yes, Your Majesty. In the corridor of Schönbrunn Palace, Count Schmalz was passionately speaking to a group of people waiting for the emperor to summon him. 100 years ago, the spear of God helped the empire repel the pagans who besieged Vienna. Now, it's time for the new crusaders to go to the Dnieper River to help them. Your Majesty will definitely agree to send troops. He was talking about the end of the 17th century when the Ottoman army besieged Vienna. At that time, Pope Innocent XI formed the Holy Alliance to reinforce Austria, and the main force was the Polish winged hussars. Someone immediately shouted, In the name of God, Holy Alliance, eliminate heresy. However, the emperor's attendant came out with a stern face and scolded everyone. Please be quiet. His Majesty said that the so-called Holy War is a Polish rumor, and no one is allowed to mention it. A group of nobles were stunned on the spot. North of Kiev. Gornostopol. General Smirnov, commander of the Ukrainian Corps, stared blankly at the cavalry in red uniforms and white wings on their backs, like surging magma, cutting into his infantry line from the side and rear without any hindrance. The Cossack cavalry battalion he sent to block just now almost collapsed in front of this magma, and then the flank of the Ukrainian infantry was exposed to the magma. Winged cavalry, Smirnov murmured with a pale face. His soldiers have begun to collapse and flee. How is this possible? Just this morning, he was still discussing with his staff how to stop the Polish army that was harassing Kiev if it wanted to escape. Yes, he didn't take the Polish army seriously at all. Although the Poles in Mozy were not afraid of death, they were always suppressed by the Russian army and had no power to fight back. He always believed that, as long as he could catch the Polish army in front of him, he could easily destroy them. Who knew that just 2 hours ago, the Poles suddenly turned around and launched a fierce attack on him. Smirnov was quite happy at first, thinking that he could get a military merit, and immediately ordered the whole army to attack and launch a counter-attack. However, what he didn't expect was that the combat effectiveness of this Polish army was extremely amazing. From training to morale to equipment, it was not inferior to the Ukrainian Corps at all. In fact, it was much higher. Kosciuszko led the most elite troops in Poland, and their morale was undoubtedly high. They had fought with the Serbian rebels for more than half a year. Although the weapons used were the same Tiller M1753 as the Russian army, they were produced under the guidance of French technicians. Both the accuracy and reliability exceeded the Russian original. Moreover, the Polish army had 17,000 people, while the Russian army that came to intercept them had only 10,000 people. As for Chaparov's Kiev garrison, it was still wandering around the city of Kiev due to lack of coordination with Smirnov. Therefore, the Ukrainian Corps and the Polish Royal 3rd Division were somewhat unable to resist as soon as they came into contact. Seeing that the situation was not right, Smirnov was about to retreat to the direction of Mozy when a winged cavalry of more than 1,000 people suddenly rushed out from the lower reaches of the Teterev River. Then it became the current situation. Lieutenant Colonel Madarinsky, commander of the winged hussars, was extremely calm. After passing through the Russian infantry, he immediately reorganized his formation and turned back to attack the Cossack cavalry that had just been dispersed. Then, the Polish infantry line immediately pressed forward and completely defeated the Russian defense line. Smirnov had no choice but to send all his reserve troops to the front, hoping to delay the Polish offensive. Then, the winged cavalry rushed back to the Ukrainian infantry, who were assembling in a fierce manner. Mozy, the town of Merets. Morkov drove his horse past the collapsed bell tower, and all he could see were wounded Russian soldiers. The bodies had been moved away, otherwise it would have looked even more miserable. In order to capture this town, he lost more than 2,000 soldiers and more than 30 cannons he had previously risked pushing all his artillery to the front to bombard the Polish army hiding in the building, and indeed achieved good results. The Polish defense line quickly retreated. However, a group of Polish stragglers risked their lives to attack his artillery position, and at the cost of all their members being killed, they destroyed more than 30 of his cannons. This group of Polish lunatics, Morkov's scalp tingled when he thought of the hellish scene he had just seen at the artillery position. More than 700 corpses covered the narrow artillery position, and almost every cannon was covered by dead Poles. Fortunately, the town had fallen into his hands after a day of rest. He could launch a general attack on Mozia at this moment. 2 blood-soaked rangers came running. When they saw Morkov, they didn't have time to stop, and they shouted in panic, "Report, the Ukrainian corps was attacked, requesting support." Chapter 685. This group of Polish lunatics, after the cavalry who came to report explained the situation in Smirnov, Morkov's face instantly darkened. "This useless guy," he cursed fiercely, then raised his eyes and looked in the direction of Mosy City. "I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network." According to the cavalry's report, the Polish army that attacked Smirnov had at least 15,000 people, and the garrison of Mosy had a total of more than 50,000 people. In other words, after deducting casualties, there were less than 30,000 Polish troops in Mosy City at this time point, and he still had nearly 60,000 troops in his hands. If he launched a fierce attack on Mosy, he should be able to break it soon. However, he hesitated again. If that Polish army attacked Kiev, Chaparov would probably not be able to hold on. Kiev was the main logistical material storage point for his army. Although he could still get supplies from Smolensk, even if he lost this place, it would be a great shame for the empire if the Poles occupied the richest city in the western part of the empire. Even for just one day, the Tsar might dismiss him from his post or even send him to prison. Thinking of this, Morkov angrily bent his whip and said to the staff, "Order the Zaporozhye Corps to stay here. The others will rest for half a day and go to Kiev tomorrow morning. Follow me to catch the rat." The next day, Morkov personally led 30,000 troops to Kiev and sent someone to order Chaparov to cooperate from the south. However, when he arrived in Kiev 4 days later, the Poles had already disappeared. After a large number of rangers scouted around Kiev, they finally learned from local farmers that the Polish army had fled to the northeast 4 days ago. Morkov immediately chased after them and then found traces of the Polish army at the Loyev ferry, but they were just traces of them having already left. The Polish army easily controlled the ferry, which was guarded by only a few hundred people, and then the entire army crossed the Dnieper River and headed towards the heart of Russia. Morkov's forehead was bulging with veins, and he threw his whip to the ground and roared, "These damn Polish lunatics, yes. The Poles must be crazy." With the Dnieper River blocking them, it was impossible for them to get any supplies. In other words, these Polish soldiers would starve to death in at most half a month. Even if they could grab food along the way, they would not be able to get enough ammunition. The local Russian garrison only needed to continue harassing and consuming their ammunition. After more than a month, they could easily capture this army without weapons. However, the Poles still chose to go deep into Russia. Morkov could imagine that they would first attack Chernigov, which was the closest place. There were only a small number of reserve troops there to replenish the consumption of Mosy, and it was impossible to resist the attack of tens of thousands of Polish troops. After looting, the Polish army would bypass the northern part of the Syra River and continue eastward along the southern side of Smolensk, directly approaching Kaluga. Kaluga is the second richest province in the central and western part of the empire, second only to Moscow. Yes, this damn place is right next to Moscow. The most cunning thing about the Poles is that the offensive route they chose cleverly avoided the Smolensk fortress in the north and the Kursk fortress in the south. When the empire arranged its defense, it did not consider that the hinterland in the center would be attacked. Usually the enemy would attack Russia from Minsk as a base, then they would face a series of strong fortresses from Smolensk to Vyazma. And if they sent troops from Mosy, they would be blocked by the river and unable to provide supplies to the army. But the Poles just chose this dead end. Morkov knew very well that 15,000 Polish troops would definitely not be able to enter Moscow, as the old capital of the empire and the economic center of the central region. The Moscow Legion was stationed there with more than 10,000 soldiers. However, as long as the Polish army appeared outside Moscow, even if no shot was fired, the losses caused by the fear of the people would be in the tens of millions of rubles. This Polish army was determined to bite off a piece of the empire before dying. By then, even if he wanted to go to prison, he would not be able to go, and the death penalty would be his only outcome. Morkov hesitated again and again, and first sent 2 teams of signalmen, one team to warn Kaluga and Moscow, to prepare for defense in advance, and the other team, to report the bad news to St. Petersburg. Then, he sent all 3,500 cavalrymen he brought to cross the Dnieper River, to track the Poles during the half-month, when he led his army to encircle and suppress Kosciuszko's troops. Moz's Polish army got a rare chance to breathe. Prince Poniatowski brought thousands of new soldiers from the rear, and with the help of the people, he reinforced the Mozy line. What awaited him was a fierce battle. But there was hope. Palace of Versailles on a morning that was no different from any other. A soft voice called out to Joseph's bedside, "Your Highness, it's already 7 o'clock, and you will preside over the opening ceremony of the Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange today." Joseph turned over, but he slept too late last night because he reviewed the documents sent from the Caribbean, and fatigue pulled his eyelids tightly. Perna called him a few more times. Recently, Camelia had a fever from time to time because of the last time she fell into the water. She was very weak, so she took over the task of taking care of the prince's daily life. Seeing that His Highness did not respond, she glanced back at the 2 maids holding the shirt behind her. Seeing that they were not looking at this side, she immediately bent down and quickly kissed him on the cheek. "You really have to get up." The soft touch helped Joseph dispel his tiredness. He opened his eyes and saw Perna's beautiful emerald eyes. "Ha, you got up so early." He yawned and smiled. Perna's cheeks flushed immediately, and she hurriedly glanced at the maids behind her. Fortunately, they still didn't pay attention to this side. Well, as the maid of the prince, it is a basic quality to have eyes. After Joseph finished washing, he let Perna do a series of examinations on his fundus, throat, pulse, etc., and then pulled her to sit at the dining table together. While waiting for the food to be served, he habitually picked up the documents beside him and saw that the top one said, "The Polish Minsk defense line suffered more than 4,000 casualties and had retreated to the suburbs of Minsk." Colonel Kaczynski led 2 infantry regiments and 5 cavalry squadrons to the north. The document did not mention Kaczynski's goal, but Joseph knew very well that he would go straight to Riga. The latter document was about the situation in Mozyr. It was much better than the situation in Minsk. After all, with the 2 Polish war gods Kosciuszko and Poniatowski in charge, the 70,000 Russian troops did not even see the city of Mozyr, and Kosciuszko's dagger had already stabbed Russia's weak belly. Chapter 686 Paris Agricultural Products Futures Exchange. Joseph picked up the milk, took a sip, put down the document, and silently blessed Kosciuszko in his heart. This is news nearly half a month ago. Poland is too far from Paris. In other words, the Polish military god should have arrived in Bryansk at this time, causing a huge shock in Russia. Joseph still admired Kosciuszko very much and sincerely hoped that he could return to Poland alive. In fact, if the plan formulated by the General Staff headquarters could be implemented smoothly, the Polish army would have a high probability of escaping. Of course, this is just a probability. Joseph sighed softly and picked up the next document. This is a report on the mobilization of Austrian and Prussian troops. Both countries looked coy, obviously trying to cover up their plans to send troops. Joseph smiled. It seemed that these 2 families were waiting for Russia to defeat Poland and then pick peaches. However, this also gave Poland a rare respite. According to the optimal military strategy of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, it should be to attack Poland at the same time, so that Poland will be attacked on 3 sides. In that case, Poland will soon find itself in an extremely difficult situation. Joseph's original estimate of the worst situation was to suggest that Poland directly sign an armistice agreement with Austria and cede the Lesser Poland region to the latter in order to stabilize the rear after repelling the Russian army. We will try to get it back. Fortunately, Puo chose greed. In this way, Poland can use these few months to recruit more troops. After the war begins, the pace of military expansion will be several times faster than usual. When Prussia and Austria start taking action, Poland can at least put out some troops to resist. Moreover, news of the confrontation between Poland and Russia should soon spread to the Western Front, which will hit the Prussian-Austrian confidence in winning the war to a certain extent. This affects morale greatly. What Joseph didn't know was that due to Mesmer's outstanding inspiration, the soldiers of Prussia and Austria, especially the Austrian army, were quite sympathetic to Poland. If they launched an attack on Poland, morale would at least be halved. Next comes the news from the Ottoman side. The first batch of Topis' new army, a total of 800 people, has completed basic training and returned to Constantinople. The second batch of 800 people will also graduate in 2 months. The training efficiency of these Sudanese soldiers in the French army camp in Tunisia was much higher than that in the Ottoman training. The previous 600 Topis soldiers had been trained for nearly 2 years, but the results were not as good as the training of this group of soldiers for just half a year. Selim III was also extremely satisfied with this batch of new soldiers with full French equipment and was already discussing the plan to attack Egypt with his ministers. The French intelligence agency judged, based on various clues, that Ottoman should take action in 3 to 5 months. It was just after the second batch of new troops completed their training. As for the batch of supplies that Joseph was most concerned about, Osman had also shipped them to the Black Sea as agreed. As for the Ottoman officer named Muhammad Ali, Styler said that he has not found it yet. This name is really too common in the Ottomans. Even with the qualification of Albanians, there were a full 12 in the Ottoman army. Styler is still observing which one is the Ali that the crown prince calls investment worthy. However, Joseph was not in a hurry. Muhammad Ali, the future king of Egypt, would take at least 10 years to develop, and Styler had enough time to screen. Styler mentioned at the end of the report that the current operation of steam paddle steamers was good. The Eastern Mediterranean Trading Company has purchased 12 steamships and they are operating in good condition. The cost is only 70% of that of traditional galleys, and the time for traveling between the east and west coast of the Mediterranean has been shortened by nearly half. This is still due to the lack of ports that can supply coal along the way. Otherwise the transportation cost can be greatly reduced. Currently, a coal supply port has been built in southern Greece. Plans are also underway in Italy, Tunisia and other places. Joseph shook his head. 12 ships is still too few. It's just that the Brest shipyard's steam paddle steamer production capacity is limited, and most of the ships built have been snatched up by ship owners engaged in inland shipping. The Eastern Mediterranean Trading Company can't even buy a few ships at a higher price. In addition, the tonnage of steamships is still relatively small, so it has not yet had a disruptive impact on the Mediterranean shipping pattern. It would take at least 100 steamships before the Eastern Mediterranean Trading Company could begin to dominate Mediterranean shipping. And that, in turn, requires investment in expanded shipyards. After breakfast, Joseph took a bus to the financial center of Paris, the former Bastille. The newly established Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange is located on the 3rd floor of the financial center. After half a year of planning, the exchange will finally officially open for business today. It is said that it is agricultural products trading, but in fact the most core trading product is sucrose. Intelligence on the situation in the Caribbean was sent back to Paris last week. First, the British Expeditionary Force began to land at Tortuga on the north side of Saint-Domingue. The French government also symbolically welcomed this and wished the British army could quell the abolitionist rebellion, and the war would soon break out. Judging from the timing of the message delivery, the fight should be in full swing by now. Regardless of victory or defeat, this year's sugarcane production will be frighteningly low. October is the season for beet harvest. The beet refinery in northwestern France will turn these beets into sugar at a rate of 2 million pounds per month. Together with the nearly 4 million pounds of sugar that Still has purchased in Egypt in the past few months, it will be enough to support the Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange's pricing power over sugar. When Joseph's carriage arrived 1 street away from the financial center. He heard a burst of noise in the distance. He looked out of the window and saw that the square of the financial center was already crowded with people. Even more lively than the Christmas mass. Joseph was not able to enter the financial center until Xod led the prince's guard to clear the road. After a routine of playing music, cutting ribbons, and speeches, Joseph announced, "The Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange is officially open." There was a burst of cheers in the hall and the square outside. Before Joseph left, the impatient merchants rushed to the trading window frantically, scaring Xod so much that he even pulled out his pistol. More than 80 guards took great pains to protect His Royal Highness the Crown Prince from leaving the trading hall. No wonder the merchants were so crazy. The news of the Black Uprising in the Caribbean had long been reported back to Europe. During this period, the price of sugar had risen by more than 40%, and it was difficult to buy sugar, even if you had money. At this time, the news that 6 million pounds of sugar will be sold at the Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange spread among merchants in European countries. Chapter 687 Sugar Franc Online. All sugar traders, even speculators who had not done sugar business before, immediately swarmed and like sharks smelling blood. Soon, the first contract was posted by an exchange employee on the wooden signboard 3 people high on the west side of the exchange hall. It was a sugar contract that expired in a month, with a price of 1 franc and 8 sous per pound. According to the regulations of the exchange, the trading unit of sugar is 10,000 pounds. In other words, this contract means that the buyer can get 10,000 pounds of spot sugar at a price of 18,000 francs in a month. Since the Dutch had created futures trading to sell tulips a long time ago, and there were many small-scale futures markets in the UK and the Netherlands, people were still very familiar with futures trading. So, all the merchants present immediately widened their eyes after the French currency reform. 1 franc was equal to 10 sous. So the price of 1 franc and 8 sous is nearly 30% higher than the current sugar market. However, a middle-aged man with small eyes and a felt hat immediately walked to the trading counter, pointed at the contract of 1 franc and 8 sous, and said in unfamiliar French that he wanted to buy it. The crowd around him immediately exclaimed, "This price is a joke. Is he crazy? Sugarcane has only increased by 40% in the past 6 months. He thinks it will increase by 28% in a month. Oh, this poor man. He will lose everything." Then, the second contract was put up. Before the man with small eyes could propose a transaction, the old man who had been waiting at the counter next to him quickly ate it. The third one was put up. It was eaten in seconds. The fourth one was eaten in seconds. The fifth one was eaten in seconds. The merchants in the hall began to fall into shock. Could it be that with a 28% premium, he couldn't get any sugar? Finally, the middle-aged man with small eyes desperately grabbed the 8th contract. The contract price had risen to 1 franc, 8 sous and 1 denier. He collected the contract with satisfaction and squeezed out of the crowd. A young man with blue eyes and a wide nose came over and bowed to him, saying in Dutch, "Mr. Van Schaik, long time no see. Are you in Paris too?" Van Schaik smiled and returned the greeting. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Weigel. This is the future of all sugar merchants, so I naturally have to come." Weigel glanced at the newly posted contract that was sold out in seconds, leaned closer and whispered, "To be honest, I think the price is too high." "Why do you?" Van Schaik hesitated for a moment, pulled him behind the stone pillars in the hall, and said in a lower voice, "The plantations in the Caribbean are all destroyed. It's hard for you to buy sugar from anywhere else except here." Weigel shook his head and said, "The Caribbean is just a reduction in production. It shouldn't be that serious, right?" Van Schaik looked around and said, "You probably don't know the order report of the London Company in the UK last week. The London Company is the British company responsible for Caribbean trade. Every year before the sugarcane matures, the trading company will go to the place of production to investigate the market and determine the purchase price. And these news can't be hidden from people with channels. I really haven't heard of this. I can tell you that it's only 35% of last year's purchase volume. And most plantation owners said they might not be able to deliver." Weigel's face changed immediately. He didn't expect the sugarcane harvest to be so serious. "What about Egypt?" It is said that all of them were ordered in advance at a high price by a mysterious buyer." Weigel were shocked. In other words, we can only buy French beet sugar in the future. The French beet sugar production was widely publicized a few months ago. After all, it is impossible to conceal the source for large-scale sales. Van Schaik spread his hands. It is very likely that this is the case. If I were not short of funds, I would definitely buy more contracts today. I estimate that sugar will rise to 2 francs per pound in a month. Weigel hurriedly looked up at the wooden board showing the contract and saw that the price of the latest contract had risen to 1 franc 8 sous 2 deniers. It turned out that I thought others were suckers, but in fact others laughed at me for not knowing how to pick up money. He hurriedly said goodbye to Van Schaik and squeezed towards the trading counter. The trading hall soon became like a battlefield, with shouts and curses, and some people even fought to grab orders. Weigel finally grabbed a contract despite having his clothes torn, and a heavy punch on his face. He excitedly put the contract in his pocket and was about to continue to grab it when he suddenly heard someone shouting behind him. Latest news. The Dutch government announced that it officially recognized the Republic of Saint Domingo. The crowd was quiet for a moment, and the next moment, they rushed to the trading counter with a more crazy posture. No one even looked at the price. Just buy it. If there is an order, it is obvious that the Saint Domingo Parliament should have implemented a ban on the sale of sugar cane. Only countries that recognize its government can buy sugar cane. And in order to buy sugar, the Dutch government bowed directly to the black rebels. In fact, for the Netherlands, Saint Domingo is a French colony, and recognizing its independence is also recognized. After all, the relationship between France and the Netherlands is average now, and the French expeditionary force has lost twice their point. But right now, the British army is fighting the black government there. What the Netherlands did was equivalent to selling out the British allies, but now whoever can buy sugar cane can make huge profits, so allies and the like can be ignored for the time being. The new contract was posted, and the price was 2 francs per pound. Almost at the same time, several counters on the west side of the exchange were squeezed down, and the traders sitting in the back were injured and screamed heartbreakingly. There was a bloody incident at the exchange. 27 people were seriously injured. Before Joseph returned to the Palace of Versailles, he received a report from the director of the police bureau, Besançon. In the carriage. The latter nodded nervously. Yes, your highness. There are more than 60 people who were slightly injured. It was all because of my improper handling. After asking about the specific situation, Joseph simply reprimanded him a few words and asked him to deal with the aftermath with the people of the exchange as soon as possible. After all, he had seen before that the police force of the exchange was not weak. After Besançon left, Joseph narrowed his eyes and said to himself, I didn't expect the Dutch to be so greedy. I haven't recognized the black government yet, and they got ahead of me, but it's good this way. With such a commotion, sugar cane will be more popular. Let's just implement that plan ahead of time. The next day. The Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange reopened after suspending trading due to a group fight. As the crowd poured into the hall, they saw that the number of police had more than doubled, and then they saw the director of the exchange standing on the newly repaired counter and said loudly, from now on, in order to facilitate settlement, those who buy contracts in francs will have priority trading rights. People were stunned. According to the current popularity of trading, what is priority trading? People without priority rights simply cannot buy contracts. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 688. International Diplomatic Pressure. French businessmen were immediately ecstatic, waving franc notes and squeezing aside foreign competitors. Many British, Dutch and Italian businessmen looked sadly at the contract market. 1 month later, the sucrose futures price had been quoted at 2 francs 1 sous, and the price quoted 3 months later had reached an astonishing 2 francs 3 sous. The look in Weigel's eyes was like someone who had been trapped in the desert for more than half a month and saw a source of water. However, the guilders in his hand could not be used to buy water. Someone suddenly grabbed his arm and whispered in his ear, "Why are you still standing here, Taiwan?" Novel network. Weigel turned around. It was Vanchig, but I didn't. The latter said in his ear, you forgot. Farchu Bank is downstairs. France is on the gold standard. I have a mind like a pebble. Wiggleton was enlightened, turned around and ran downstairs. Thank you so much. The gold standard means that anyone can exchange franc notes for gold at the Bank of France at any time, and in turn, gold can be exchanged for francs at any time. The counter of the French Reserve Bank is still relatively empty. After all, most people have not yet reacted. Weigel immediately converted more than 10,000 Dutch guilders in his hand into francs, although the Dutch guilder as a currency cannot be absolutely valuable. Officially, one Dutch guilder should contain 3.75 grams of gold, but in fact it is less than 3.7 grams. Weigel can only treat it as gold, not gold. The currency was converted into francs. Fortunately, he could get a 2% subsidy when exchanging real gold for banknotes, which reduced his losses somewhat. Afterwards, Weigel returned to the futures trading floor with great momentum, bypassed a group of foreign businessmen, and bought 4 contracts in one go. Others quickly noticed the Dutchman, and then, suddenly realizing it, they rushed downstairs like a tide. The counter of the Reserve Bank of France also experienced the scene at the futures exchange yesterday. The counter was overwhelmed. Fortunately, there were many police officers maintaining order today, but there were no casualties as of 5 p.m. that day. When the futures exchange closed, the Reserve Bank of France had received a total of more than 8,000 ounces of gold, equivalent to approximately 900,000 francs. This is because the French bank's maintenance counter was closed for 3 hours. Otherwise it would be easy to exceed 1 million. Just half a month after the Paris Agricultural Products Futures Exchange opened for business, European countries began to feel the severe market turmoil caused by the skyrocketing price of sucrose. So under the call of the United Kingdom, representatives from various countries gathered in Frankfurt to participate in the European Sugar Special Conference. Without much greeting, the British representative Lord Marquis stood up, looked around the crowd proudly, and said loudly, obviously, it is France that is primarily responsible for the sugar crisis. The conference hall suddenly fell silent. Some representatives looked at the French representative Bailly, while others bowed their heads and remained silent. Marquez continued, as we all know, the core cause of the sugar shortage was the outbreak of black slave riots in the Caribbean, which caused a large number of plantations to reduce production or even stop harvesting. The first area where riots occurred was the French colony of Saint-Domingue. I have a lot of evidence to prove that the riots in other places in the Caribbean are related to the abolitionist organization in Saint-Domingue. As he spoke, he threw several documents on the conference table angrily. These are records of the activities of Frenchman Jacques-Pierre Brisset in Saint-Domingue. We have reason to believe that it was he who led the abolitionist movement there. That damn Vincent Auger was always under Brisset's command. This is not because the British intelligence agency is so powerful, but mainly because there are more and more people in the Saint-Domingue abolitionist organization, and it will be difficult to ensure that confidential information is not leaked in the later stage. Furthermore, most of the weapons used by the niggers in the Caribbean were supplied by France. I think the French government must give other countries an explanation for the situation in the Caribbean and the current serious sugar shortage. The British are obviously fully prepared, and their purpose is to use international diplomatic pressure to get France, currently the largest sugar source in Europe, to make a commitment to proactively stabilize the price of sucrose. The UK is the world's largest consumer of sugar. Right now, the price of sucrose has increased by 67% compared with the same period last year, and futures half a year later have increased by as much as 160%. Even though the British government has begun to implement measures such as tax exemptions for sugar merchants, sugar prices continue to skyrocket. It is foreseeable that the British, especially the lower class people, will soon be unable to afford sweets. Sugar is the British's biggest daily pastime, and even their spiritual sustenance. No one drinks tea and coffee without sugar. Black bread must be dipped in syrup, porridge must be added with sugar, and fried fish must be sprinkled with icing sugar. It can be said that without sugar, British housewives cannot even cook. With the current trend of rising sugar prices, the British people are going to riot. Several of Britain's old friends, Prussia, Denmark, Portugal, etc. immediately joined in the uproar and condemned France for destroying the international environment and trade pattern. He waited until these guys were almost finished performing. Then he slowly took out a stack of pamphlets and motioned to his assistants to distribute them to the representatives sitting here. Perhaps you have learned from other channels that the Duke of Leeds in England was the first culprit to incite the black riots in Saint-Domingue. You can take a look at these materials, which clearly show how he contacted Auger and others and provided them with a huge sum of £300,000. Later, the Duke of Leeds also planned to take Booker's gang to the United States. He gestured around the conference table. If the United States also sent representatives, he would tell everyone about this in detail. The representatives of various countries flipped through the evidence provided by the French, only glanced at a few pages, and then looked at Marquis with strange expressions. This evidence is too detailed. Just kidding. Auger, as a direct participant in the Duke of Leeds' plan, naturally provided solid evidence. Even the remittance channel of the 300,000 funds was clearly written. Bay continued. As for Brissett, everyone knows that he is a fanatical abolitionist lunatic. It was after the Duke of Leeds set off the black riots in Saint-Domingue that he was attracted and went to the Caribbean. Oh, the time when he left Europe can be easily found out. Our country is also very troubled by this man. You know, his behavior in Saint-Domingue has caused our country more than 50 million francs in losses every year. For this, I hope the British government can give our country an explanation. Lord Marquis saw that all countries were glaring at him, especially Spain, and his heart tightened immediately. I didn't expect that the French were more prepared than himself, and he knew that the French were confusing right and wrong, but he couldn't defend himself at all. He suddenly thought of something and said loudly, "No, France has not suffered any losses at all. On the contrary, you have gained huge benefits from the situation in the Caribbean." Chapter 689. Claude Sharp. Lord Marquis pointed at Bailey and said, "It's just a coincidence that the sugarcane production in the Caribbean has just decreased, and France's beet sugar production has appeared on a large scale. Isn't this too much of a coincidence? You must be planning to destroy the sugar supply in the Caribbean, so that your beet sugar can be sold at a high price. Yes, now a pound of sugar has been sold for 1 shilling and 4 pence. You made a lot of money. What else do you have to say?" Bailey suddenly laughed. "You are really humorous, Mr. Envoy. Why don't you calculate it yourself? Our country lost 50 million francs in Saint-Domingue, and our beet sugar production can only produce £2 million per month, with an annual profit of less than 30 million francs. Do you think our country will be like a brainless bull, crashing everything just to make itself lose money? He is just bullying other countries because of information asymmetry. First, France did not suffer such a huge loss in Saint-Domingue. The 50 million francs are calculated based on the fact that no sugar is produced. In fact, even if there is war damage, at least 30% to 40% of the previous output can be achieved. Second, the scale of sugar beet cultivation in France is far from saturated. As long as it achieves profitability, it will not be difficult to double it several times in the future. Moreover, the price of sugarcane is still rising. Now it makes a profit of 30 million francs per year, and it may be 40 million or 50 million in a few months. Finally, Joseph's biggest goal is actually the sugarcane franc. So even if it really loses some money, as long as it can greatly increase the influence and circulation of the franc, this deal is definitely worthwhile. This Lord Marquis was stunned. The wind direction reversed, and representatives of various countries glared at him again. Bay took advantage of the victory and pursued. "Speaking of losses, our country has sent 2 expeditionary forces to quell the Saint-Domingue rebellion, which cost a lot. In fact, Joseph only sent the so-called expeditionary force to deliver equipment to Auger, which only had more than 1,000 regular soldiers, so the cost was extremely low, and the 2 dispatches cost only about 3 million francs in comparison. The British sent Brand to lead 4,000 expeditionary forces to the Caribbean, spending more than £400,000, or more than 10 million francs. Our Second Expeditionary Force had already stabilized the situation in Saint-Domingue, and at this time, General Brand of the United Kingdom asked our country to transfer troops from Saint-Domingue to help them quell the rebellion in the Bahamas. As a result, as soon as our army left, Auger took the opportunity to occupy the Magua fortress, causing the situation in Saint-Domingue to completely get out of control. I have reason to suspect that Britain has always colluded with the Saint-Domingue rebels to destroy our colonies. What you said is not true, Marquis said angrily. General Brand has found out that your Gallisonia colluded with the black rebels, exposing our flank to the blacks, which eventually led to our defeat. It is impossible to keep a complete secret on such a large battlefield with tens of thousands of soldiers involved in the war. Brand only captured a few black officers and quickly interrogated them to find out that they had received orders not to attack the French army. Only then did he realize that he was being calculated by the French. Bailey sneered disdainfully. You are completely a boring slander. Marquis waved his fist and said, I have witnesses. Who? The officers of the Bahamian rebels. Before Bailey spoke, representatives from other countries laughed. The testimony of the blacks was a joke. In their minds, the blacks were hardly even human beings, so how could they use their testimony to accuse French officers? Bailey waited for the surroundings to quiet down, and then continued. As for our country's beet sugar production, it was a complete accident. Before, our country didn't even know that there was such a technology. It was a Bavarian scholar who came to ask His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to sponsor his research, so some were planted. The cost of refining sugar from beets is extremely high, and His Royal Highness is still losing money. As for the specific cost of beet sugar production, only the French Minister of Agriculture has detailed data. Isn't it just Bailey who can say it now? Marquis was completely confused. The French are too insidious. He knew that France was behind this, but no one believed it. Instead, they all believed that it was Britain who manipulated the abolition movement in Saint-Domingue, but it went too far and eventually affected the entire Caribbean. Even the Dutch and Portuguese envoys looked at him with extreme dissatisfaction at this time. After all, these two countries also have colonies in the Caribbean, and this abolition storm has also caused them heavy losses in the end. This grand European sugar special conference failed to achieve any results and ended hastily. In fact, Bailey drafted a statement condemning Britain, but only Spain was willing to sign it. Other countries, considering their huge trade with Britain, chose to forget about it, so they finally gave up. However, this special meeting gave French beet sugar a great free GG. Just 1 week later, the trading volume of the Paris Futures Exchange soared by 35%. Even the sugar futures contracts for a year later were almost sold out. And the franc banknotes were also sought after by all merchants overnight, easier to carry than gold and silver coins, and can be used to buy scarce sugar at any time. There is no reason not to accept it. Under the influence of merchants, ordinary people gradually began to accept francs. Palace of Versailles. In the study of the Crown Prince, Joseph listened to Bailey's report on the Frankfurt meeting, but frowned slightly. He could foresee that the price increase of sugar would be a huge blow to Britain. If Britain wants to solve this crisis, it can only rely on launching foreign wars to divert conflicts, unless it takes the initiative to lower the export price of sugarcane. It is definitely impossible to lower the price. The franc is now in a period of rapid growth. Last month, the French Reserve Bank exchanged tens of millions of francs of banknotes. All this money went into the hands of foreigners, which is equivalent to letting them recognize the credit of the franc. Lowering the price of sugarcane at this time isn't itself destructive market enthusiasm. Therefore, it is estimated that the British will speed up the process of launching a war anyway. This war is inevitable. After all, there can only be one hegemon in Europe. The current hegemon Britain will never sit idly by and watch France challenge its position. And the huge profits earned from sugarcane this time can also increase France's chances of winning in future wars. As soon as Bailey left, Berthier came right after. Joseph smiled and greeted the chief of staff. I just wanted to talk to you about accelerating preparations for war. Oh, what are you doing here, Your Highness? Last time you asked me to try to use the ship owner communication mode for military command. Berthier said, gesturing behind him. In fact, Mr. Claude Chap has already submitted a similar invention to the General Staff, and it has more advanced functions. Chapter 690. The Crown Prince has always stood on the shoulders of giants. Mr. Chap, Joseph, felt that he had heard this name before, so he looked at the young man who seemed very nervous. You already have mature equipment? That's great. Chap hurriedly stepped forward and saluted respectfully. It's an honor to meet you, Your Highness. I did design a letter delivery device. Joseph smiled and nodded. Can you show it to me? Of course. Chap hurriedly took out a huge roll of drawings with trepidation and unfolded it on the table. Your Highness, look, this is it. I call it remote writing. Chap pointed to the water tower-like thing on the drawing and introduced. The main body of the equipment is built on a high tower. It looks a bit like a huge closed drying rack, but it is actually a rotating beam with a swing arm at each end. Joseph then noticed that there was a T-shaped device like an antenna on the top of the water tower point. As Chap spoke, he began to get excited. The two swing arms can rotate to different angles, and with the cooperation of each other, they can make more than 90 postures. If we use each posture to correspond to a letter, we can form any paragraph by connecting them together. And a few kilometers away, there will be another signal tower. There will be a signalman on it, who will use a telescope to observe the posture of the swing arm on the previous tower, record it, and translate it into letters. Then, this signal tower can continue to pass on the content of the letter. We only need to build a signal tower every 10 kilometers. I have done a lot of experiments before, and this distance can clearly see the movement of the swing arm to quickly transmit the content of the letter to a far place. He looked at the Crown Prince with expectation. Your Highness, I think this is dozens of times faster than using horses to deliver letters. When Joseph heard dozens of times faster than horses, he suddenly remembered that he seemed to have seen in historical materials that Napoleon had people build a set of efficient optical communication mechanisms. As a result, after his defeat at Waterloo, the news reached Paris in less than 2 days, causing chaos and making it impossible for the emperor to return to Paris to stabilize the political situation. It seems that this is the invention of Mr. Chap. Joseph immediately asked, is there a signal tower built? I want to see the effect. Berthier took 2 steps forward awkwardly. Your Highness, due to the high cost of building a signal tower, the General Staff is still evaluating the availability. Joseph sighed secretly. This can't be blamed on the General Staff. No matter what era, accepting new things is a difficult process. After all, most of them may just be a waste of money. But he can be sure that Chap's design is reasonable and feasible. This is exactly the telegraph system of the 18th century. Especially in war, information is even more important than cannons. If a usable long-distance communication system can be built before the war with Britain breaks out, it will bring huge military advantages to France. Joseph looked at Chap. How long does it take to build a signal tower? The latter thought for a moment and hesitated. If there is sufficient funding, it will take about 20 days. So long? Joseph frowned slightly. He felt that this was just a 2 or 3 story water tower, and with a wooden frame on top, it should be done in a week. Chap pointed to the swing arm on the drawing with some embarrassment and said, Your Highness, the signal frame requires a precise pulley system and bearings, which will be more troublesome to make. Of course, when mass production begins, the speed will be much faster. Joseph looked at the drawing and said casually, how much does a signal tower cost? About 2,000 francs, Your Highness. Joseph opened his mouth involuntarily. So expensive? 2,000 francs is almost enough to buy a house in the suburbs of Paris. He immediately noticed the complex pulley and swing arm system on the signal frame, and estimated that half of the cost was spent on this. Wait. He wondered, why use such a complicated swing arm? Sharp patiently explained, Your Highness, we need to transmit 26 letters and 10 numbers. The swing arm must rotate at least 45 degrees to be clearly distinguished from a distance, so we must have a rotatable beam and 2 swing arms so that we can get more than 40 postures required. You see, this swing arm is up, this side is to the left, it is A. Turn it down here, the beam is tilted 45 degrees, it is C. Joseph stared at the winch on the drawing and asked again, How long does it take to pose a letter like this? After you become proficient, it will take about 5 to 8 seconds, Your Highness. The swing arm is more than 3 meters long, and the signalman needs to rotate the winch more than 10 times to drive the swing arm to rotate once. Rotating 2 swing arms and a beam must be very time consuming. Joseph frowned. This can be simplified into 3 fixed vertical rods with retractable tops. Use Morse code to transmit signals. Fixed vertical rods. Sharp shook his head repeatedly. That would require 15, and each retractable state represents a letter. By the way, what is Morse code, Joseph? Remember that Morse code would not be invented until more than 40 years later. He picked up a pen and drew on the paper, saying, the top of the vertical rod extends out to represent horizontal and retracts to represent dot. Similarly, different combinations of dots and horizontals represent different letters, such as this combination is A sharps. Eyes widened immediately. His mind was very flexible, and he immediately realized that His Royal Highness's method was feasible. Using 3 vertical rods, 6 dots or horizontals can be compared by rising and falling twice. For the signalman, the operation is to push and pull the handle 6 times, which is definitely much faster than desperately turning the capstan. Moreover, this method only requires 3 hollow wooden rods, avoiding any pullers and bearings, and the estimated cost will not exceed 50 francs. He was so excited that he nodded repeatedly. Your Highness, this is amazing. Such a simple method solves a very complex problem. Why didn't I think of it? You are simply the greatest inventor I have ever seen. Joseph was a little ashamed, thinking that this was all Mr. Morse's credit, and I just copied it. Chap rolled up his blueprints. Your Highness, using the Morse code mode you mentioned, is that the name? I estimate that a signal tower can be built in about a week. Very. But, Joseph nodded and turned to Berthier and said, please give Mr. Chap all the support he needs to complete the test as soon as possible. Yes, Your Highness. What Joseph didn't know was that in history, Chap submitted a report to the French military for 3 years before he received a grant of 6,000 francs for testing. It took another year before the official construction began. And he shortened the process to an afternoon. Chapter 691. Let's start the second stage directly. After giving instructions about the optical signal tower, Chap withdrew first, while Joseph talked to Berthier about preparations for war. You may have heard that at the Stuttgart meeting, the British openly criticized our country. Following this trend, war may break out at any time. Berthier nodded solemnly. Yes, Your Highness. The General Staff has reached a similar conclusion and has been making preparations. So, where does the General Staff think the British will take action? First of all, it must be a comprehensive naval blockade. Berthier said, our country's trade with the Americas, the Far East, and even the Mediterranean coast will be seriously affected. The situation will be more serious than during the 7 Years' War. Moreover, this time the Dutch fleet is likely to be under British command. Of course, in this era without radar, a so-called comprehensive blockade is impossible. France also has the second largest navy in Europe. It can still conduct some trade by covering its own merchant ships on certain routes, but the total volume will inevitably drop significantly. Joseph comforted the Chief of General Staff. I can assure you that at least in the Mediterranean, it is impossible for the British to be unruly. As a military boss, Berthier naturally heard about the steam battleship and nodded immediately. This will give our army a huge strategic space. He quickly returned to his own work. The British army is simply not enough to challenge us, so they will definitely rely on Prussia, Hanover, and Saxony to send troops together. Britain and Hanover can mobilize about 100,000 troops. Prussia's mobilization limit is close to 200,000. Judging from the current situation, Austria's attitude is also very worthy of vigilance. They can mobilize more than 250,000 soldiers. The more likely attack route is to cross the Rhine from Koblenz and attack the Verdun area in our country, and go south from the southern Netherlands to Lille. There will even be dangers in the direction of Italy. Berthier briefly introduced the strategic judgment of the General Staff, and then talked about preparations for war. Your Highness, the 5th, 6th, and 7th Royal Infantry Divisions, the 12th Royal Skirmishers, the 6th and 11th Royal Dragoons, and the 3rd Royal Cavalry Regiment have all been formed. The reorganization of the Royal Guards Corps is also nearing completion. At present, the new army under the General Staff has a total of 71,000 people. This number can increase by about 3,000 by the end of the year. According to Joseph's request, France's new army has carried out a comprehensive division regiment battalion model reorganization since the beginning of the year. Consistent with the Emperor's era point, this has been repeatedly proven in history that the organizational structure that is most suitable for this era can be copied directly. In fact, in less than 5 years, all European countries will undergo similar reorganizations. The Chief of General Staff continued, as for the old army, it still maintains a size of about 90,000. However, standardized training has basically been completed, and percussion guns have been popularized in terms of equipment. Some of the better legions are even equipped with bulletproof inserts. The size of the old army has been greatly reduced from the 120,000 soldiers 2 years ago. This reduction is mainly due to checking the vacancies and absorbing outstanding soldiers into the new army. As for the standardized training formulated by the General Staff, it is only slightly stricter than before, and it is far from the training intensity of the Guards Corps. After all, they are soldiers under the traditional military nobles. It is impossible for them to keep up with the training pace of the new army, at least not because of their physical fitness. The noble master cannot provide them with high quality food to maintain their health. But even so, the training volume of the French Old Army has exceeded Europe, and even the British lobster soldiers cannot compare with them. But they are at the bottom of the contempt chain of soldiers in France. While Berthier was talking, Perna suddenly appeared outside the door with an anxious look on her face. Seeing that the Chief of General Staff was also present, she had to pace back and forth, but did not disturb their business. After a while, Joseph noticed her figure and hurriedly signaled Berthier to pause and looked towards the door. "What's the matter with you?" The female doctor walked in quickly and said anxiously, "Your Highness, Camelia's situation seems not to be good." Caribbean. C. Santo Domingo. In the original Parliament building in Port-au-Prince, the new commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Marquis Cunningham, sat at a table with a sullen face. All the chairs here had been dismantled and moved, and looked at the man next to him who was reading a press release. The staff officer waved his hand. "That's it. No one cares about it anyway. He has not fought a decent battle since taking over from Brand to command the battle in the Caribbean a month and a half ago." Before his expeditionary force passed Bermuda, Saint-Domingue President Auger announced that he would leave the capital, Port-au-Prince, with all his members, and enter the Douat Mountains to continue presiding over government affairs. Yes, this new government, which was only established a few months ago, took the initiative to go into exile in a gorgeous way. Joseph had long expected the situation in Saint-Domingue at this time. Britain was still the most powerful country in the world, and if it was determined to deal with the black governments in the Caribbean, the latter would have no power to fight back. He remembered that in history, most similar new regimes would fight the invaders with all their heart, and then, defeated in disgrace, they would go into exile. On the contrary, once these governments start to go into exile, they will become the nightmare of the empire, causing the latter to fall into a situation of long-term consumption. There is no other reason. The imperial army can't find a target to fight, and can't retreat. Even if the soldiers just bask in the sun every day, the military expenditure will be lost like a flood. What's more, the locals can't help but cause trouble for you. So Joseph's strategy for Saint-Domingue is to skip the hard stage and start exile directly. In the few months since the establishment of the Republic of Saint-Domingue, all blacks on the island have been freed, and plantation owners have also been compensated. The compensation is still from the £300,000 funded by the Duke of Leeds. Then, Auger ordered the evacuation of Port-au-Prince, and a large amount of food and ammunition was scattered and stored in Mount Douat, enough for 1 or 2 years. Douat is a large mountain range in the central part of Saint-Domingue, occupying nearly 1/3 of the island's area, with sufficient space for roundabout maneuvers. The last presidential decree of Auger, before leaving Port-au-Prince, was to call on the people of the country to resist the British invaders. So, The Marquis Cunningham sat in Port-au-Prince for nearly 50 days. All he did was listen to the casualties of the army attacked and call on people from all walks of life in Saint Domingo to come to the capital to re-elect the parliament in the newspaper, but the white people here were all French and ignored the British officer's solicitation. The black people, with bloodshot eyes, only wanted to kill the British soldiers. Chapter 692 Nightmare in the Caribbean. USA Point Philadelphia Point in the chamber of the Capitol. Hamilton stood on the floor, waved his right hand, and said loudly, "After 20 years, the arrogant British have once again crushed our trade rights and trampled our dignity under their feet. The federal government must maintain our country's trade routes in the Caribbean at all costs. We must take an absolutely tough stance and ask the British to immediately release all illegally seized merchant ships and promise not to continue to intercept or arrest our ships and crews." As the toughest representative of American hawks, lawmakers usually don't react much to his words. Writing this, I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network. However, this time, a loud shout erupted in the conference hall. "Must be tough on the British. Immediately issue a diplomatic protest. Free trade must not be undermined." More than a dozen congressmen were so excited that they walked to the stage, stood behind Hamilton, and waved in support. No wonder they share the same hatred. Just over a month ago, the newly established government of Saint Domingue issued a special trade license to the United States. This is pie in the sky. After the independence of Saint Domingue, merchant ships without a trading license could not buy a sugar cane from their point, and this sudden special license means that American businessmen only need to load sugar cane in Santo Domingo and then go to Europe. With the current sky-high price of cane sugar, they can easily make a huge profit of 140%. Of course, this license was actually brought by a French consultant from Paris. According to the secret agreement between France and Saint Domingue, sugar cane produced in Saint Domingue within 10 years can only be sold to people with French authorization. Although Joseph believed that there was a high probability that the Saint Domingue government could drag down the British Expeditionary Force, considering that the island's output was single and many supplies relied on external imports, he decided to get close to the United States to help. As he expected, the Americans immediately went crazy. Massive merchant ships flocked to Port-au-Prince like hungry dogs after smelling meat. However, the British Navy blocked the harbor in order to prevent the black government of Saint Domingue from receiving supplies from the outside world. Soon, several American merchant ships were seized by the British for financing riots, but this did not stop Americans from continuing their enthusiasm. Under the temptation of 140% profit, let alone naval guns, even if God sends divine punishment, don't let them back down. At the same time, savvy businessmen turned to loading and unloading goods at previously inconspicuous ports such as Port Azar and Puerto Plata on Santo Domingo Island. The British fleet could only patrol around the island day and night and was exhausted, but it also arrested more American ships. Finally, the US government broke out. Well, many of the sugar transportation businesses in the Caribbean are invested by US congressmen or the big capitalists they represent. By seizing merchant ships, the British Navy was taking the money out of their pockets. Hamilton raised his hand to signal the members to be quiet and said solemnly, "I suggest that a naval fleet should be sent to escort our merchant ships to ensure that the British no longer harm our country's legitimate interests." His words once again received a storm of shouts. "Send in the Navy." Never. Bow to the British. Use warships to keep waterways open. The US Navy had just shown its prowess in the Caribbean 2 years ago, beating pirates like lost dogs. Congressmen have full confidence in the Navy. With unprecedented efficiency, the US Congress unanimously passed the Special Caribbean Trade Act the next morning. Of course, the rapid passage of this bill was due not only to the interests of the sugar trade, but also to Americans' revenge for the black riots in Georgia. Although Americans also felt that it was strange that Britain supported black slaves to cause trouble in the United States. Before there were other clues, most congressmen were inclined to let Britain take the blame. A few days later, 3 unassuming American frigates appeared off the coast of Santo Domingo south of Santo Domingo. As it Brigadier General Toussaint Louverture, Minister of the Army of the Republic, looked at the map and ordered the officers beside him, "We are very close to Cocos, so let the soldiers march as close to the woods as possible and keep quiet. Also, take back all the scout cavalry, and be careful not to alert the British." "Yes, General." Before the officer turned around, he heard intensive gunshots in the distance. Louverture suddenly frowned. Could it be that his whereabouts had been discovered? He only brought more than 700 soldiers. If the British were prepared, it would be difficult for this small force to defeat the 300 British troops in the Cocos camp point. Just as he was hesitating whether to turn around and return to Douat Mountain, a mixed-race cavalry galloped over and shouted, "General, a resistance force is attacking Cocos town and has already entered the north side of the town." The so-called resistance army is a civilian armed force formed in various parts of Saint-Domingue. Louverture was greatly astonished. He was very aware of the combat effectiveness of the resistance army. Most of the members were newly liberated black slaves, and it was rare to know how to shoot. Unexpectedly, these people actually broke through the British camp. He immediately ordered, "Speed up the march and help them." By the time he led his army to Cocos town, the fighting here was already heating up. More than 100 British soldiers, relying on the mill in the town, were fiercely fighting with 200 or 300 resistance troops. The appearance of Louverture's troops instantly crushed the British will to resist. A white flag flew on the top of the mill. Not long after, the Minister of War of Saint Domingo met the commander of the resistance army who attacked here. After praising the latter, he asked curiously, "So, how many soldiers did you lead to attack the town of Cocos?" "We have 260 people, General." "So few?" Louverture's eyes widened immediately. "How did you break into the town?" "The intelligence I received said that there are more than 300 British troops stationed here." The commander of the resistance army nodded. "There are indeed 300 white people here, General, but my relatives in the town told me a few days ago that hundreds of them have yellow fever, and many of the remaining ones have diarrhea, so I decided to try my luck." The yellow fever obviously seriously affected the morale of the British army, so that they were entangled by a group of rabble and eventually defeated by Louverture's regular army. The battlefield situation was quickly summarized to Louverture. Only more than 130 British soldiers in the town were completely healthy. Yellow fever, dysentery, and brown urine almost destroyed the army. In fact, similar situations can be seen everywhere among the British troops on the island, especially yellow fever, which spreads extremely fiercely. Yes, even in October, the temperature here is still above 25 degrees, and there are mosquitoes everywhere that can almost drown people, carrying the ravages of yellow fever for the British soldiers who lack immunity. This is a hellish nightmare. Chapter 693 Dividends and Tableau. While the British army continued to reduce its numbers due to disease, the black governments of Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Lesser Andros Islands began to send troops to reinforce Saint-Domingue. They are all members of the Caribbean Military Council. Even if Saint-Domingue, the strongest black regime, falls, other governments will have the fate of being ousted one by the British. In addition, these islands have received assistance from Santo Domingo before, so now they are naturally sparing no effort to return the aid. Search TWKAN on Google. As a result, black volunteers boarded American merchant ships from various islands every day and continuously gathered in Santo Domingo. American merchant ships also brought a large amount of food, clothing, medicine, and even military horses and other supplies to support tens of thousands of black soldiers in the Douat Mountains, and launched continuous attacks on the British Army. London. Number 10 Downing Street. The situation seems quite serious. Lord Grenville put Marquis Cunningham's report on the table and looked at Little Pete. This report is filled with despair. Only 4,000 of the 7,500 soldiers of the expeditionary force are currently capable of maintaining combat capability, and the others are suffering from various diseases. In the past few months, only about 300 British soldiers have died in battle, but as many as 530 have died of illness. This was the number 2 months ago, and there are only more soldiers getting sick now. At the same time, although Marquis Cunningham occupied the important towns on the island such as Port-au-Prince, Marion, and Magua, he could never find the main force of the rebels. He tried to go into the mountains to look for those Negus, but was troubled by the wet and muddy environment, and voluntarily withdrew after half a month. At the end of the report, Marquis Cunningham stated that, unless London could send an additional 4,000 expeditionary troops to the Caribbean, he would be unable to defend Port-au-Prince in at most 6 months. It's worse than the worst case scenario I imagined. Little Pete sighed. By the way, you should have heard that Spain is also preparing to recognize the nigger government. In other words, there will be 3 big countries recognize the independence of Saint-Domingue. Yes, after the Netherlands, the Americans also recognized the Republic of Saint-Domingue, driven by huge sugar profits. It's 4. Grenville corrected. France will do the same soon. Little Pete nodded. Yes. Frankly speaking, the French are really one step ahead this time. After such a long game, if the British still can't see that France is behind the situation in the Caribbean, then they really don't have to sit on the throne of the world's hegemon. General Jervis and the Marquis of Windham both advocate continuing to increase the number of troops. He glanced at the Foreign Secretary. What do you think? Jervis was Lord of the Sea. Windham is the former British War Secretary. If you try to grab everything, you will get nothing in the end. Grenville said, Santo Domingo is obviously a bottomless pit. We have now thrown nearly £500,000 into it. In addition to the casualties of soldiers, nothing was gained. It's time to give up. Little Pete pressed the armrest of the chair hard, took a deep breath, and said, but we need sucrose. The solution is France. Grenville said without hesitation, as long as France can be brought to its knees, we can ask them to sell beet sugar at subsidized prices. Even after black people in the Caribbean lose support, we can find ways to regain control there. Little Pete smiled. There is a person who has exactly the same opinions as you. Do you know who he is? You. No, it's the Marquis of Wellesley. Grenville nodded. I heard that his military reforms are going well. It will be more productive if there are no constraints from those old-fashioned people. So, we must speed up the process of starting the war. The problem now is that our allies haven't had their snack yet. Little Peter was naturally referring to the Prussian-Austrian partition of Poland. Grenville immediately said, then help them buy a new set of tabloids. You know, this is a necessary expense. Little Pete smiled. I will ask someone to propose a £500,000 tabloid budget in Parliament the day after tomorrow. Please support it. This is a matter of duty. Afterwards, the two detailed the terms of aid to Poirot, and then Grenville prepared to stand up and leave. He had just taken a few steps when he suddenly remembered something and turned around. By the way, Mr. Peter, maybe we can get some dividends back from the Caribbean. What do you mean? Give the Caribbean to the Americans, Grenville said. We cannot let the French control it. Little Peter nodded thoughtfully. It seems like you should go to Philadelphia. With pleasure. Western Poland. Poznan Province. General Horn looked back at the fortress behind him without much sense of accomplishment. The Poles were almost defenseless, with less than 600 soldiers stationed in the most important fortress in western Poland. Just one day after Potsdam declared war on Poland, he led his army to easily capture it. His Majesty the King must be regretting it now, and should not have delayed taking action until now. Horn glanced westward. Thank you, His Majesty George III. What he said was true. If the British had not asked William II to send troops immediately on the condition of a low-interest loan of £250,000, the latter would have planned to wait until Russia eliminated the main Polish forces before declaring war. It is said that this loan is issued monthly. If Prussia fails to achieve the military goals agreed by both parties, the loan will be suspended. Horn looked to the north again and said to himself, at this rate, it should take less than 2 months. Maybe 1 month is enough. William II's order to him was to occupy the entire Greater Poland region and the most important port of Gdansk within 2 months. In the next 3 days, Horn led his 35,000 troops through Gniezno like a tour and declared the occupation of this place without any fighting. The Poles always naively trusted the Prussian alliance treaty. Even though they removed Prussian officers from the military command system at the repeated request of the French Crown Prince, they did not believe that Prussia would attack them at all. So much so that just 10 days ago, Count Potocki, the Polish foreign minister, went to Potsdam to meet with William II and asked him to send troops from East Prussia to help Poland resist Russian aggression. William II rejected him flatly on the grounds that the Polish constitution was passed without the permission of Prussia. Then, Horn's army stabbed Poland in the back. At the combat meeting that night, Horn looked at the map of Poland in front of him and said to one of his generals, "General Hopner, you lead the Stendhal Corps, the Berlin Corps, and the Royal 7th Artillery Battalion to continue the attack in the direction of Calais." He looked around at several other officers and said, "Others, follow me north immediately and occupied Gdansk as quickly as possible." Chapter 694 Silver Eagle Defense Battle. Gdansk is located on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. Writing this, I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network. After the 1 million, Prussia had occupied all the cities around the port, turning it into a Polish enclave. The reason why Horn was so eager to attack Gdansk was not because he thought it would be difficult to capture and that he needed to plan ahead. On the contrary, Prussia now unanimously believes that, as long as it sends an army at will, Gdansk can be easily obtained. Horn's targets were the valuable goods of Polish merchants in the port, as well as Polish merchant ships. News of the war will soon reach Gdansk, and he must get there as quickly as possible, in order to catch as many big fish as possible. So he even left behind the clumsy artillery battalion, and took only the Royal Brandenburg Regiment and more than 10 cavalry squadrons, totaling more than 13,000 people, to march northward. Port of Gdansk. In the 3-story red building next to the Royal Mile, 16 members of the Gdansk Management Committee were arguing fiercely. "We only have 400 soldiers, and I'm afraid we won't be able to defend it for even half an hour. Handing over port management rights to the Prussian army is our only option." I agree. The Prussian army will abide by the co-management agreement and ensure that we, ensure the safety of merchants and goods. Committee Chairman Kavolich lowered his head and murmured, "However, the two countries are already in a state of war. If the Prussian army is allowed to, the daily affairs of Gdansk are handled by this management committee, so he is equivalent to the mayor." Someone immediately said, "We can't do anything at all. Any obstruction will only anger them." That's right. And we haven't received any combat orders from His Majesty the King. Gdansk has no border with mainland Poland, so it is impossible to receive any information from the mainland. Several committee members sitting on the west side of the room quietly watched these people arguing, looking at each other from time to time, showing disdainful smiles. They are Prussians. Although Gdansk is Polish territory, Prussia also has considerable administrative rights. Things in the world are so magical sometimes. Although Prussia had declared war on Poland, due to long-standing custom, they still sat with the Poles to discuss the fate of the port. The Prussian army should be arriving here soon. Now they are the masters here. Only by begging them to come forward can the Poles avoid being treated harshly by the army. Ta ta ta. There were bursts of footsteps outside the door, and then the door was kicked open with a bang. In the surprised eyes of Kavolich and others, Port Sheriff Romolev, wearing a grey-green uniform, rushed in with a pistol. Behind him were more than 20 patrolmen, all carrying flintlock rifles. What are you going to do?" Romolev ignored the committee members' inquiries, looked straight to the west side of the hall, and said loudly, "Werner Bangelman." The Prussian commissioner in a black coat nodded subconsciously. Romolev raised his gun without hesitation and pulled the trigger. Bang. Bangelman was overturned by the huge momentum, and a black and red hole appeared in his chest. The sheriff read another name, Kurt Müller. The patrolman next to him stepped forward and shot the stunned Prussian commissar to death. Only then did the other 4 Prussians react and fled towards the door as hard as they could, but fell to the ground after several gunshots were fired. Are you crazy?" A committee member looked at the corpse on the ground and exclaimed. Romolev put away his gun, signaled his men to carry the body out, and then looked at the other committee members. "Gentlemen, there is no need to hesitate anymore. We have only one option left, and that is to defend Gdansk." Committee Chairman Kavolich shook his head tremblingly. It's over. We are all going to die now." Romolev said, "Please sign an order to arrest all Prussians in the port." No. Behind The patrolmen, a middle-aged man wearing a felt hat and capable eyes, came out and said to Kavodeach, "We must not hand over the port to the perfidious Prussians. Please believe me, we will definitely be able to hold it. Gdańsk, Mr. Schumann." The person who came was none other than Pierre Edgar Schumann, the financial officer appointed by the French investors. Of course, his other identity is the artillery captain of the French Royal Guards Corps, but "we simply don't have enough troops," Schumann pointed out the window and interrupted. "There are thousands of sailors and more dock workers here, and they are all willing to fight to the death for Poland." Kavodejic shook his head. "Even if these people are included, they are no match for the Prussian army. They will send at least tens of thousands of soldiers. We can rely on the fortress," Schumann said confidently. "Fortress?" Kavodejic asked in surprise. "Where did the fortress come from?" "Baron Lacast's new residence," Schumann said, taking out a drawing and spreading it out. "It was designed with defense in mind." "What is drawn on the drawing is the luxurious manor newly built at the entrance of the port's separate peninsula. Baron Lacast is one of the shareholders of this huge investment of 4 million francs. He previously said that he liked the scenery of the port very much and spent money to build a holiday estate here. This is a bastion?" A member of the committee who was slightly familiar with military affairs exclaimed immediately when he saw the drawing. "Yes, Joseph had to use all means to deploy the defense of Gdansk when the Poles did not believe that Prussia would invade them. Fortunately, there was the example of the Silver Eagle Defense War in which Poland defended Gdansk during World War II. For reference, at that time, Nazi Germany sent 10,000 soldiers, supervised by 1,500 SS troops, and planned to capture Gdansk in 15 minutes. However, hundreds of Polish defenders in the port cleverly used the terrain of the Steppe Peninsula to deal with the German army. The German army attacked fiercely for a week, even dispatching warships and bombers, but still failed to enter Gdansk. In the end, the Polish government surrendered and ordered the Polish defenders in the port to abandon their defense, so that the Germans were able to occupy it. At that time, the Polish army's method was to tightly control the entrance to the Steppe Peninsula. The port of Gdansk is divided into two parts: the land on the south side and the peninsula on the north side. There is a narrow waterway between the two, which can be used as a safe haven for ships, as long as the peninsula on the north side is occupied. The southern part of the port can be covered with artillery fire. At the same time, the entrance to the peninsula is very narrow, and a few bunkers can block the passage here. Joseph used a bastion instead, which would only be more effective. In order to avoid the Prussians from making trouble. He claimed to the outside that it was the manor of Baron Lacast. From the outside it did look like a castle-like building. Only a few French engineers in charge of the construction knew that the full picture here was a pentagonal bastion with rounded corners. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 695 Bastion. Kavodejic looked at the other members, swallowed his saliva, and was still very hesitant. "Mr. Schumann, even if the sailors and workers are willing to defend Gdansk, we don't have enough weapons." Schumann smiled slightly. "In fact, I also do some less compliant business. Don't report me. The Fat Firth parked in the port is my ship, which is loaded with weapons sold to the Middle East. If necessary, you can let my Persian buyers wait a little longer." Kavodejic widened his eyes. What a coincidence. Can you tell me how much cargo is on it?" 3,500 flintlock rifles, and enough matching ammunition for 4 months. This is naturally not a merchant ship to be shipped to Persia, but Joseph had prepared it for Gdansk a long time ago and has been parked outside the port. Thank you for your mercy on Gdansk." The fear on Kavajevic's face finally disappeared. As a Pole and an investor in the port, he certainly didn't want it to fall into the hands of foreigners. Before, he was unable to resist and could only choose to surrender, but now he saw hope. Romilev also looked at Schumann with great surprise and excitement. He originally planned to take his 400 patrolmen to protect the port at all costs. but he didn't expect the French to bring so many surprises. He remembered another thing. Mr. Schumann, we still need some cannons. If you have, I don't have any cannons. Seeing the disappointment of everyone, Schumann immediately continued, but have you forgotten? There are many armed merchant ships here, and we can dismantle the cannons on the ships and use them. Romolev frowned. The ship owner will probably not be willing to lend it to us. Schumann looked at Kovacevic. Please forcibly requisition all merchant ships in the port in the name of the committee. How can this be done? Exclamation mark. Tell them that any ship that contributes to the port defense can obtain tax exemption for 1 to 3 years. I believe they will be happy. An hour later, the patrol team began to arrest Prussians in the city point at the same time. A large number of pamphlets about how Prussia betrayed its trust and colluded with Russia to stab Poland spread throughout Gdansk point. At the end of the pamphlet, the Gdansk Management Committee called on everyone to go to warehouse number 1 to sign up and jointly guard the port point, and promised that those who were disabled during the battle could enjoy pensions. According to the treatment of the Polish regular army point, the pamphlet was naturally printed in advance and piled in the bottom warehouse of the Fatfirth point almost instantly. The whole of Gdansk was ignited by anger. Whether it was sailors or dock workers, they all cursed the Prussians' shameless behavior loudly and gathered in front of warehouse number 1. Many of them actually wanted to return to Warsaw to participate in the fight against Russia. But because Prussia blocked the roads between Marienburg and Tuchel on the pretext of something, they could only wait until the next time they went out to sea, landing in Courland, and then heading south to return home. Now, they can fight for their motherland in Gdansk. 4 days later, Horn led the Prussian army, exhausted from the continuous journey, to Gdansk. The situation that he expected the Poles to panic and greet them did not happen, and even the Prussians in the port did not show up. He knew that there should be 600 or 700 Prussians working here or operating merchant ships soon. Several cavalrymen returned to report that the city of Gdansk was almost empty and the things in the buildings had basically been moved away. Horn squeezed the whip hard in anger. He had rushed here at the fastest speed, but the cowardly Poles still slipped away. He breathed a sigh of relief. Although the unexpected windfall was gone, at least this important port was captured, and His Majesty the King would still issue commendations and rewards. He turned to the officer beside him and said, "Let the soldiers control the port. Pay attention to searching the warehouses. Maybe there are things that have not been moved away in time." In a luxurious villa, Horn was discussing the next battle plan for the attack on Kyiv with his officers, but suddenly heard the rumbling sound of artillery from the northeast. He frowned and went to the window and saw black smoke rising in the middle of the port. He immediately turned to the messenger and said, "Send someone to see what happened." Before the latter walked out of the temporary command post, a messenger rushed in, found Horn's attendant, and said breathlessly, "Report. There is a bastion on the east side of the Steplet Peninsula. We were attacked by intensive Polish artillery fire there and lost more than 40 people. This is because the Prussian army underestimated the Poles. They approached the Baron Lacast's manor without any reconnaissance, and as a result, half of the company was taken away by the artillery in an instant. Well, the sailors on the Fat Fells are very good at operating artillery. After all, they have studied artillery for more than a year at the Paris Police Academy. These more than 100 skilled artillerymen have become the core combat force in the bastion. Horn's face suddenly darkened. He had never received any information about the construction of bastions in Gdansk before. When he arrived at the Steplet Peninsula, he finally saw the beautifully built manor and the gun muzzles on the inner courtyard wall through the telescope. Schumann requisitioned more than 80 cannons from merchant ships docked at the port of Gdansk. Although these guns are not easy to operate on land, they are good in quantity. Aim at a small area in advance and fire the gun wherever the enemy appears, which is quite efficient. Horn immediately ordered 2 battalions of skirmishers to attack the well-decorated fortress. According to intelligence, there are only 400 Polish patrolmen in the port. These guys between the police and the army will not be very strong in combat. Even with the support of the bastion, it is difficult to withstand the attack of thousands of regular troops. However, when the Prussian soldiers finally approached the bastion under the bombardment of the cannon, Thousands of black gun barrels stretched out from the outer wall of the bastion point. Although there was almost no volley and even no aiming, the space in front of the bastion was very narrow, and the Russians gathered here were still hit by flying bullets and suffered heavy casualties, unlike the need to line up infantry lines in field battles to increase firepower. There is no requirement for queues when defending fortresses. As long as you can use a flintlock, you can stand in a fixed position and shoot at will point. This is why Schumann dared to let the dock workers participate in the defense after a simple training point. Horn watched his soldiers retreat and angrily asked the staff to dispatch artillery to bombard. Then he remembered that all the artillery battalions were handed over to Hopner. It was not until half a month later that a dozen artillery pieces were transported to Gdansk Point at the same time. The news that Western Poland and Gdansk were invaded by Prussia had also been reported back to Warsaw. Chapter 696, The Useless King. Warsaw Point, Royal Castle Point. Stanislaw II looked at the mark of the enemy invasion on the map with a solemn expression and murmured to himself with great self-blame, "Everything is as expected by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. We should have listened to his advice." Just now, Royal Minister Malachowski had analyzed the current situation for him. According to the latest intelligence sent back to Warsaw, Poland is facing enemies on all sides. Russia in the east is attacking Lithuania and the west bank of the Dnieper River at the same time. A week ago, Prussia and Austria also declared war on Poland. The Speaker of the Senate, Stasits, lowered his head and whispered, "Yes, we trusted the Covenant too much. If they could deploy some defensive measures in Poznan at the beginning, the Prussian army would not have been able to capture the three western provinces in just a few days. What is more serious is that the Lithuanian Corps was defeated under the fierce attack of the Russian army. Kolesnikov and Minsk has shown a trend of being unable to defend. After a while, the King of Poland sighed and looked at Malachowski and said, "So, what is the military committee's suggestion, Your Majesty?" "Warsaw has 5 newly formed regiments," the latter said. "General Bilek needs at least 4 regiments to stabilize the defense line." Bilek was the commander of the Minsk defense. Stasik frowned. "In other words, we have no troops to send to the Western Front." "I'm afraid that's the case." Several Polish ministers in the room all looked gloomy. Poland has tried its best, but still can't withstand the siege of the 3 major powers. Is there only one result left? Surrender. Stanislaw II suddenly pointed to Krakow in the southwest of the map and asked, "How many troops are needed to hold back the Austrian army?" The royal minister looked at the officer standing by the gate, who was an advisor to the military committee. The latter thought for a while and said, "If we defend with all our strength, it will take about 10,000 people. Your Majesty, currently, Warsaw can mobilize only 5 regiments, or 7,500 people." The king looked at Malachowski again. "How long will it take you to form another 4 regiments?" 2 months. The latter paused and gritted his teeth. "No, Your Majesty, I can gather 4 regiments in just 40 days. Now, Poland is united in hatred of the enemy, and morale is very high. There are crowds of people in front of the military commission, several enlistment registration points every day. No matter nobles, businessmen, workers, or peasants, they all enthusiastically ask to join the crusaders, to drive out invaders for their motherland. There is no shortage of soldiers. There are at least 20,000 to 30,000 people on the military commission's new recruits registration list. This is the result of young and healthy applicants. If the requirements are relaxed, more than 50,000 people can be recruited. But the army is not just a group of people, and then give them some guns. A minimum level of military training must be completed, otherwise they will not be able to line up on the battlefield, and they will not understand the orders. Not only will they be unable to defend against the enemy, but they will also bring chaos to their side. Fortunately, the Royal Military Academy in Warsaw was built half a year ago, and there are a large number of ready-made instructors available. This is also the reason why Malachowski is confident that he can pull out 4 regiments within 40 days. Of course, such a short time can only ensure that the soldiers can pick up guns and shoot, and they will not get separated. There is no need to expect combat effectiveness. 40 days. Stanislaw II pressed hard on the map, as if he had made a great determination, and said solemnly to the royal minister, "I can get you at least 1 month in the direction of Minsk. Please recruit troops as soon as possible, and The existing 5 regiments will all be sent to Krakow. We must not lose the Tarnowsk Mountain silver mine. At present, the silver mine supports nearly half of Poland's financial consumption. If there is a problem there, Poland will almost collapse immediately. Your Majesty, what are you going to do? The King of Poland seemed a little embarrassed, but still said, I still have the status of a king. And I have some, favors in Russia. These should be able to buy a month. Wachowski immediately thought of something, and shook his head repeatedly. Your Majesty, you can't do this. Stanislaw II smiled. I'm not good at politics and military affairs. In fact, I also know that the Tsar pushed me to be the king, because he saw that I was useless. No, you are definitely not. The king was very calm. Anyway, my reputation has never been good, and this is all I can do for my country. Oh, the people will definitely be disappointed in me in the future. Joseph is more suitable to be the king than me, and I hope the parliament can fully support him. Joseph is the name of Prince Poniatowski. The king then told his plan. Several important officials in the room shook their heads at once. Your Majesty, how can this be done? Poland needs you. We must have other ways. Stanislaw II waved his hand. Let me fight with everyone. Western Poland. The fallen province of Poznan. The Polish foreign minister, Count Potocki, sat in a chair with his head down, his fists clenched so tightly that the joints had lost their color. In his pocket was the armistice agreement that the parliament had passed. Today, he will hand it over to the Prussians here, exchanging the 3 provinces of Greater Poland and the city of Gdansk in humiliating exchange for the Prussian withdrawal. Yes, Poland can no longer spare the troops to defend the northwest. Potocki looked at his pocket watch. He had been waiting here for more than an hour. The Prussians obviously wanted to humiliate him more. At this moment, his attendant quietly walked up behind him, leaned down and whispered, Sir, there is a Prussian local tax collector who wants to see you on urgent matters. Oh, he is from Kulm. Kulm? Potocki narrowed his eyes. Kulm was a Polish territory 20 years ago, and Catholicism is still practiced there. The Polish foreign minister excused himself that he couldn't stand the musty smell of the chair, so he got up and went outside. A short man with half-white hair passed by him, as if nothing had happened. The moment he was closest to him, he suddenly slowed down and whispered in pure Polish, Please report to Warsaw that Gdańsk has not fallen, Captain. Rommel and his French friends are holding on there. He said they can hold on for at least 3 months, and his body will be the last obstacle in front of the enemy. Potocki's heart immediately beat wildly, trying his best to suppress his excitement, and confirmed, Are you telling the truth? I swear. When I received the news, I came from Toru to see you overnight. The short man made a sign of the cross on his chest. May God bless Poland. Potocki looked forward, nodded in salute, and then crumpled the armistice agreement in his pocket into a ball. Chapter 697 Civil War. Henzin, West Central Voivodeship of Poland. In a marching column of hundreds of people, Herbert Schmitz hummed a newly learned tune. Poland is always strong. As long as I'm alive, no matter what the enemy takes from here, I regained them all with the sword. Go forward, Kosciuszko. It was the famous Poland Never Dies, the future Polish national anthem. It's just that its author, Józef Wybicki, named it Poland Forever Strong this time, and the word destruction in the lyrics also disappeared. Historically, at this time the Russian army had already surrounded Warsaw, but for now, Poland's defense line remains on its eastern border. Schmitz walked to the beat of the military drum, his fingers groping for the letter in his pocket. It was sent by his brother last week, saying that he had set off to Poland with the Legion, and should be able to meet him soon, and then join the glorious Holy War together. Well, his older brother, Mort Schmitz, was a captain in the Austrian Royal Carpathian Regiment. However, his status as an officer also limits him. Herbert Schmitz himself came to Poland from his hometown in Nowossowsk for more than half a month, and obtained the rank of Sergeant of the Holy Crusader Legion, and is now rushing to the battlefield. And the elder brother has just set off. Perhaps by the time his brother meets the Russians, he will have been promoted to a military rank similar to his. Herbert Schmitz thought with a smile on his lips. Crusade, what a romantic experience. The army had gone a long way, and it was estimated that they had reached the outer suburbs of Warsaw. Suddenly, several horses chased up from behind the team. A Polish major shouted loudly, "Wait a minute. Stop." The commander, Major Feckert, immediately signaled to the herald. The drumbeat changed awkwardly, and the soldiers stopped. The Polish major exchanged a few words with Feckert in a low voice. The latter suddenly turned pale. After hesitating for a moment, he jumped on a large stone half a man's height, and said loudly in German, "Everyone, listen. Charles Tro, Major K has something to tell you all." Officers and soldiers immediately turned to look at him. Trock said something excitedly in Polish. Feckert frowned, but quickly translated for him. "Unfortunately, our king, well, declared war on Poland a few days ago." There was a sudden commotion among the soldiers. Bert Schmitz confirmed in an incredibly loud voice, "Sir, did you mean declaration of war rather than alliance?" "Yes, declare war." Feckert nodded and cursed softly. "Damn it, it's like shit, Major." Trocker continued, "At this time, Austria's 25,000 strong army is passing through Novi Sącz. It is expected that it will launch an attack on Krakow in 4 to 7 days. Feckert translated helplessly. And his team has already exploded. Why invade Poland? Surely this is not His Majesty the King's order, right? What kind of bastard is colluding with Russian heretics? Is this how they repay our friends who helped us defend Vienna?" This team was composed of volunteers who came from Austria to support the Polish jihad. They fully expected that the Austrian government would send troops to help Poland resist Russia, but they did not expect to hear such news. Trock first bowed deeply to everyone, and then said, "There are almost no troops garrisoned in Krakow, and we never expected that Vienna would attack there. Therefore, Warsaw has to send all the soldiers it can mobilize to Krakow, and you are the most experienced team here. On behalf of His Majesty the King, I beg you to help us defend Krakow, please, for God's sake." Herbert Schmitz took a few steps forward with a gloomy face and shouted, "I'll go." Someone immediately shouted, "I'll go too. I also want to teach those idiots a lesson." And an hour later, the team of more than 800 people turned southwest and rushed to Krakow. Krakow outside the town of Chebinaya on the south side of the Tarnowsk Mountain silver mine. An Austrian artilleryman slowly stuffed the shell into the muzzle. The loader gave it a few random hits with the pestle rod, and then the igniter let the fuse. There was a roar, and the shell drew an arc and flew into the bushes on the east side. The artillery company commander looked through the binoculars and did not blame the gunner. Instead, he sat down on the ammunition box and let his men do what they wanted. Yes, they didn't know they were fighting Poles until they entered Poland. Before that, except for mid-level and senior officers, the Austrian soldiers thought they were going to fight the Russians on the eastern front of Poland. Soon, General Wilms's guards came to the artillery position as supervisors. The 8 cannons here fired all morning, but only one shell hit the Polish position. The general was already furious. Well, the unlucky guy who shot the Pole had been scolded by his comrades before. He was also a little unjust, as his technique was really poor and his aim was off target. After several artillerymen were whipped, a gap was finally blasted out of the Polish position. Then Wilms directly transferred the Royal Grenadier Battalion and took the lead in rushing into the Polish defense line. The Polish troops, wearing uniforms of various styles and colors, quickly retreated, completely abandoning the town. Wilms looked at the situation in the telescope and ordered the cavalry to pursue. He originally thought he would not encounter any resistance. After all, the Polish army in Krakow should only be a few hundred people. However, there were at least 2,000 soldiers blocking the town just now. "General, it seems that it is just a ragtag group temporarily organized by the Poles." The staff officer on the side also put down his telescope. "Maybe we can capture the silver mine tomorrow." Wilms nodded. "Order the troops to enter the town. The technical academy there can make the soldiers excited." He was extremely dissatisfied with today's battle. 2 consecutive attacks by the Royal German Infantry Regiment were blocked by the rabble. About an hour later, just as he and his officers were discussing how to control the entire Krakow as soon as possible, several gunshots were suddenly heard in the distance. He frowned. He didn't order the artillery to participate in the pursuit. Why did they run so far? After a while, 2 cavalrymen rushed over in panic and reported to him, "General, Major Murat was ambushed in the west of the town, and 3 cavalry squadrons were defeated." Wilms's expression suddenly froze, and just as he was about to order the troops to be withdrawn, another ranger came to report that traces of enemy cavalry had been found on the left wing. There are even cavalry in this rabble. Wilms suddenly felt that the situation was not good. And his hunch was confirmed. The next day, the Austrian army fought hard with the Polish army in the town of Chabinia. What Wilms did not expect was that there were more than 2,800 Polish soldiers here. To be precise, only more than 800 of them were mercenaries recruited from Italy and Switzerland, while the rest were patrols from mining companies and armed miners. Chapter 698. This is our mine. You bastards, don't try to take away our mines. Beside the stone water tank on the east side of the town of Chabinia, the miner Old Vitcher raised his gun and shot at the Austrian soldiers wearing grey and white military uniforms in the distance. He has been a miner for more than 20 years, and he never thought that one day he would go to the battlefield to kill the enemy. But he and his fellow workers did an outstanding job. More than half a month has passed since the Austrian army entered Krakow, and a small part of the town of Chabinia is still in the hands of the Uman Mining Company. If anyone has any doubts about the fighting will of these armed miners, reality will definitely give him a few hard slaps. In fact, these miners were even more determined than the army to defend Krakow. In the past, they could barely survive on food and clothing. Once they got sick or injured, their families would go hungry. After French investors brought the most advanced steam engines, the output of silver mines doubled, their wages also increased significantly, and the mines also provided good benefits. Now not only do they not have to worry about food and drink, but they can also eat 2 or 3 meals of meat every week. New clothes, new furniture and the like are no longer a fantasy. It's okay if you have to suffer all the time. Once a person experiences the taste of a good life, he is unwilling to go back to the past. Yes, I don't even want to die in the physical sense. When they knew that the Austrians were coming to rob the silver mine, they immediately gathered spontaneously without anyone's call, holding the flintlock guns they had been issued when dealing with the gangsters, saying that they would defend the silver mine to the death. The more than 200 Austrian soldiers in front of them were still more than 90 steps away, basically not within the range of the flintlock point, but after a burst of gunfire, they all turned around and fled in panic, as if they had been hit by a cannon. Some even threw away their guns. Note 1. It's not that the miners are very skilled in shooting, it's just that the morale of the Austrian army is too low, and no one wants to be shot for this meaningless war. The miner captain shouted, "The enemy has retreated, stop shooting." The position next to the sink immediately fell silent. These miners have a very big advantage, that is, they are very obedient to orders. For such extremely dangerous work as mining, those who disobey management usually do not live long. These cowards. Old Vitch's son put away his note and cursed with a smile. The voices of co-workers came from the side. No, they didn't even get far enough last time. The bush in front is probably a place they will never reach. Suddenly, the captain shouted, "Be careful. They are back again." Old Vitcher looked around with a relaxed expression and saw more than 300 Austrian soldiers lined up in a tight line, pressing towards them with the sound of drums behind them. There were dozens of officers in white and green military uniforms. Farther away were Wilmser and his staff. The Austrian general had been forced to personally come to the front to oversee the battalion-sized offensive, and he also used extreme caution to attack with nearly 10 times the force. There were only more than 40 miners on the water tank side. The Austrian soldiers were forced to advance until they were less than 40 steps away from the miners, and then raised their guns amid the officers' angry curses. The miners fired as fast as they could, but their numbers were too small to cause serious damage to the enemy. The previous situation where the Austrian army collapsed at the first touch was not at all due to their superb shooting skills. "Shoot!" an Austrian major shouted. Under the surveillance of the supervising team, the soldiers of the 3 companies reluctantly pulled the trigger. A burst of intense gunfire passed through the town, and nearly half of the miners groaned and were knocked to the ground by the bullets. The Austrian army's numerical advantage was too great. If a firefight actually started, the miners would be unable to resist. The miner captain covered his arm that was shot and shouted hoarsely, "Retreat! Retreat to the jewelry store." Old Vicha hurriedly picked up his son and ran north with his co-workers. There was another burst of gunfire behind him, and when he looked back, the captain was still holding a flintlock gun in one hand. Standing motionless in front of the sink point, he lowered his head and ran with his companions to the jewelry store, only to find that the mercenary positions here were also fiercely shooting at the Austrian army. The enemy is obviously several times more numerous than our own people. Yes, although the morale of the Austrian army was low, Wilmser was also a battle-hardened professional officer. After discovering that his soldiers were passive and idle, he immediately carried out a targeted deployment for half a month. He dispersed all the soldiers around the town of Chebinaya, all fighting in battalion-sized units. He sent his own guards to supervise the battle together with the battalion commander, and authorized the shooting of any soldier who dared to retreat. At the same time, he himself patrolled the battlefield. Under such strict orders, after 5 days of fierce fighting, 20,000 Austrian troops finally drove the mining company's defenders out of the town of Chebinia. With the sound of gunfire everywhere, Old Vicha ventured to the top of a two-story building and finally saw the flag of the company patrol. He jumped from the window and greeted the nearly 100 miners gathered together over there at Mrs. Mary Ush's flower shop. Hurry up. When they arrived at the flower shop, they heard the patrol captain Makorski saying to a mercenary officer, "There are too many enemies. We have to retreat to the Tarnovsk mountains." Then, Old Vicha led his son and followed the patrol team to retreat to the northwest. Soon, gunshots were heard in front. Makavsky rode over on horseback and shouted to everyone, "There are Austrian troops blocking the way ahead. Everyone go east." Old Vicha nodded nervously and said to his son he must be referring to the path next to the ore washing pool, where you can also enter the mountain. In fact, the mine was bare and not very suitable for defense. But at the moment, they only had this choice. A team of mercenaries was left behind, and the rebels of the mining company had just seen the ore washing pool from a distance when the roar of cannons came from the front. The sound of breaking through the air passed by, and a tree more than 10 steps away from Old Vicha was broken in half by the shells, and wood chips flew everywhere. Makavsky's face suddenly turned pale. There are also enemies in front. However, the main force of the Austrian army was on the flank, and there were enemies behind them. If they could not go up the mountain, they would be surrounded and killed here. The locals that Wormser had captured through interrogation had already figured out the terrain near the mine and blocked all roads in advance. Although the morale of the Austrian soldiers was low, they had to shoot to protect themselves in the face of the Poles rushing over. Makavsky drew his sword and shouted, "Follow me." The miners immediately shouted, "Don't be afraid of them. This is our mine. No one can stop us. Everyone go." Old Vicha followed the drumbeats and walked towards the Austrian infantry line in front of the ore washing pool and pulled his son, who was rushing in front, back and blocked him behind him. Blood spurted out from time to time and his co-workers fell one by one, but the drumbeats did not stop and they all continued to move forward until they could clearly see the flames spewing from the Austrians' guns. Chapter 699 Despair and Hope. Finally, the commander's voice came to my ears. "Aim. Shoot." Old Vicha and his son raised their guns together and shot at the Austrians on the opposite side. However, there was no formation on their side, and the shooting was extremely irregular. Only a dozen people fell on the Austrian line. Instead, the Swiss mercenaries suddenly spread out in column formation and shot dozens of enemy soldiers at close range. Makorski immediately pointed there and shouted, "Concentrate the attack there, everyone. Hold on. For the sake of the mines and for Poland, Leo." Vicha immediately signaled his son to approach the enemy's gap together, loading and shooting from time to time on the way, and then moved forward. He kept frowning, praying in his heart that he would not be hit by a bullet, and that the bullet fired at his son would be diverted to himself. Then he thought about the comfortable life at home over the past year, the white bread with butter, and the girl from the Donald family that his son liked. If they can drive away the invaders this time, they can get engaged. His feet accelerated a bit, and he rushed until he was less than 50 steps away from the enemy. Then he suddenly stopped, raised his gun, and pulled the trigger. A blood flower exploded in front of him, and he hit the guy. He looked back at his son, and then fielding calmly. Bullets whizzed past his ears from time to time, but his prayers seemed to have an effect, and he was never hit. He ran a few steps forward, raised his gun, and fired. There were fewer and fewer co-workers around him, and his mind went blank. There was only one thought, and that was, that he must not escape. "Ah, little." Vich's shout came from behind. Old Vich's heart tightened, and he turned around to look, only to see his son getting up again. There seemed to be no scratches on his body except for the dirt. "I'm fine," little Vich shouted, aiming his gun. "I tripped and fell." Old Vich almost cried, gritted his teeth, and took a few steps forward, almost reaching the Austrian defense line. Several patrol members suddenly passed by him, and he actually saw Makorski's figure. "Malik, follow me." Old Vich shouted to his son, "Hold on and it will be over." Little Vich has already followed in the footsteps of Makorski. Dozens of people pulled the trigger one after another, and the gap in the Austrian defense line on the opposite side immediately expanded a few points. The patrolman next to him was hit, and blood flowed to Leo Wich's feet. He tremblingly took out the gunpowder bag and poured it towards the muzzle of the gun, ready for the next bullet to penetrate his body at any time. At this moment, the Austrians on the opposite side suddenly let out a series of shouts, and then began to turn around and run away. It turned out that it was old Vich's shot just now that killed the guy in the white and green military uniform behind the Austrian defense line. The rout spread quickly. In less than 3 minutes, the entire Austrian infantry line disintegrated. The supervisory team could not stop more than 1,500 soldiers. In order not to be trampled to death, they had to flee with them. After a few more sporadic gunshots, the battlefield became quiet. Makorski walked out of the smoke, raised his flintlock and shouted excitedly, "We won. We fought them off." A miner next to him started crying, I'm not dead. Woo woo. Anthony, are you okay? Those cowards, they ran away." "Yes, we won. We won." Leo Welly looked at the corpses on the ground around him, but he didn't feel any sadness. He just hugged his son tightly. In fact, during the charge just now, nearly 400 people from the mining company died, while the Austrian army only lost more than 100 people. However, the Poles resolutely used their crude shooting skills to fight the enemy without any hesitation. The low morale of the Austrian army once again caused them to collapse. Makorski continued loudly, "Where's the drummer? Come here. There's also a flag bearer. Quick, get everyone together. We have to go up the mountain as soon as possible." The mercenaries and miners around the battlefield gathered here one after another, and soon they roughly formed a team, following Makorski around the mining pool. The path was right in front of them. At this moment, the sound of military drums suddenly appeared in front of them. A gust of wind blew away the thick smoke, and everyone in the mining company froze on the spot. Just 200 steps away, there was a narrow grey-white human wall watching them quietly. It was obvious that Wilmser relied on his strength advantage to deploy more than one line of defense. Old Wicher felt a bitter taste in his mouth, glanced at his son, and silently began to load the gun. Makorski took a deep breath, took the flag, and came to the front of the team. "Follow me, we can win again." In fact, he knew very well that the fighting just now had exhausted everyone's physical strength and fighting spirit. If you can rest for a few hours, you may be able to break through the enemy's obstruction. But now, I'm afraid they will all fall at the foot of Tarnovsk mountain. The mercenaries began to retreat. Although the mining company offered them extremely high commissions, it was impossible to win the situation at this time. They don't want to die. But the miners gathered around Makorski. The military drum sounded immediately, and they lined up in an irregular queue and slowly walked towards the Austrian army. This is their home and their mine. If they don't fight, who can they expect to? Not long after, more than 1,000 miners entered the firing range of the Austrian infantry lines. The Austrian soldiers looked a little surprised when they looked at the Poles, who were blackened by gunpowder smoke and had many scars. For a moment, they forgot to shoot. Instead, Makorski shouted, "Aim." Shoot. The miners raised their guns and fired, then reloaded and moved forward resolutely. As he walked, old Vicher crossed himself on his chest and murmured softly, "Oh God, please give me grace." Whether it was an illusion or not. He felt that the firepower of the Austrian army on the opposite side seemed to be much weaker than before. When they stopped and fired a round of volleys under Makorski's order, several cracks appeared in the Austrian defense line. The Austrian soldiers shouted in terror and began to run in all directions, and they seemed to be frightened out of their wits. Many of them ran to the miners and were shot to death one after another. Little Welicha came over, pointed to the opposite side and said, "Father, why do I feel like there are gunshots in the distance?" More than 10 minutes later, the soldiers on the Austrian defense line knelt down and surrendered under the gaze of the stunned miners. Immediately afterwards, a group of soldiers in different clothes walked out of the smoke behind them with guns in hand. "It's reinforcement." Makorski immediately waved his hands excitedly and shouted, "We are the resistance of Union Mining Company. Thank you." "Who sent you?" There was a burst of German speaking from the other side. Immediately, someone shouted in broken Polish, "We are volunteers from New Sanki, Crusaders." The two parties made contact carefully, and when Makorski saw the certificate issued by the Polish government handed over by Major Fickett, he finally felt relieved. "Thank God, long live the Crusaders. You are the real Austrians." Just as the miners were holding the volunteers and celebrating ecstatically, Major Fickett suddenly frowned and looked south. There was a sound like heavy rain pounding on the roof. "It's the cavalry." Chapter 700 Loyalty and Shame. Before the mining pool, all the miners fell into silence. The rumble of horse hooves in the distance struck each of them hard in the heart. Makorski glanced at the narrow mountain road behind him, which could only accommodate 2 or 3 people walking side by side. There were nearly 2,000 miners and volunteers combined, and it would take at least half an hour for them all to go up the mountain. The Austrian cavalry would not give them this chance. He sighed, explained the current situation to Major Feckett's translator, and then said, "It seems that we have to repel those cavalry first." Fickett frowned and looked around at the exhausted and scarred miners, and said, "You need to rest. Retreat into the mountains first. I will stop them here." "How can this be done? You just saved." "Stop being so nagging. You don't have much fighting power at the moment." Fickett patted him, lowered his head and said, "Please believe me, this is not His Majesty the Emperor's decision. Please forgive him." As he spoke, he waved to the volunteers and said loudly, "Line up. Quick, form 3 rows horizontally to block the mountain pass. The enemy may be here in more than 10 minutes. Makorski hesitated and finally saluted him seriously, and then ordered the uninjured people in the patrol to stay and help, and the others immediately withdrew into Tarnovsk mountain. Old Vicha roughly counted the number of volunteers, then sighed, took off the grey-green coat that he had only worn for a month, and put it into his son's hand. "I told your mother before that Telomiloki's price was too high, and asked her to return it. But she didn't listen. Look, now it proves that she is right. It should be very cold in the mountains recently, so you should put it on." Little Vicha took the clothes in surprise and was about to ask, but saw his father turn around and run to Makorski, saying loudly, "Captain, I still have strength. Oh, and I have enough ammunition." The latter nodded and motioned for him to join the patrol. That little Welicha was about to follow, but his father stared back with stern eyes. The miners and mercenaries followed the winding path up the mountain. Next to the mining pool, 800 volunteers began to line up under the command of officers. An Austrian artilleryman who had been captured before carefully raised his head, pouted to the side and rear of the volunteer guarding him, and whispered that the cannon over there, maybe, can still be used. It is a basic requirement for artillerymen to nail the fire doors of cannons before retreating or surrendering to prevent them from being captured by the enemy, but it seemed that he had not done so just now. Not long after, about 500 to 600 Austrian hussars appeared in Fickett's field of vision. Behind the volunteers' defense line, the cannon roared, and a shell flew over the heads of the Austrian cavalry, but it also made them shrink back in fear. Most of the volunteers were small nobles or businessmen, and were not very good at operating cannons. The hussars whistled, and instead of charging into the bayonets of the volunteers, they passed in front of their ranks, and fired a round of carbine fire. The Austrian commander looked back at the formation of the volunteers, led his men in a circle, and attacked again towards the weakest point. Major Fouquet ordered the reserves to fill the gap, and ordered the rear to fire. The cannon had been replaced with great bullets, and fired a shot at the cavalry group at close range. This time, the shells that dispersed in large areas finally paid off. 3 cavalrymen were thrown off their horses, and blood spattered far away. But this Austrian cavalry was obviously the elite of Wilms's men, and it did not slow down at all. It flew past the established attack position, causing chaos in the volunteer queue. In this way, after the hussars repeatedly charged 5 or 6 times, the volunteers' defense line had become distorted, and only a dozen soldiers were still holding on in the most prominent position on the east side. If it weren't for the help of cannons, it might have been torn apart just now. The cavalry commander immediately discovered the fighter plane and did not even let his men reload. Instead, he turned around and rushed there in a triangular formation. Victor, lead people to block the left wing. Fouquet had already stood beside the defense line and shouted loudly, "The cannon is also aimed there." 2 squads of hussars galloped past the volunteer salient. The saber instantly swept away several soldiers. The cavalry moved around to the right. The cavalry team behind them immediately stared at the gap formed by the dead soldiers, and rushed over with their swords waving. The cannon rang out, killing the 4 cavalrymen at the front, but those behind stepped on their scraps and slammed into the infantry. A dozen horses and their riders fell over, and the 3 or 4 cavalrymen behind them were already approaching. The only people standing in front of them were 2 volunteers with bayonets raised diagonally. There was gunfire from the back row. It was reinforcement from Victor's company, but they were still more than 60 steps away, so they could only run and shoot. The third group of cavalry on the opposite side has already begun to move. Herbert Schmitz's legs were trembling, and his mind was blank. He only knew that he was holding the flintlock tightly, waiting for the cavalry to hit his bayonet, or for their saber to hit him. The black shadow of the cavalry carrying a strong wind deftly avoided his bayonet, but the saber reflecting the cold light stopped in midair. The cavalryman's voice trembled. "Herbert, is it you, Herbert?" Schmitz looked up and saw his brother's face reflected in the sunlight. "Elder brother, get out of the way, you will die." "No, Mold," Schmitz yelled. "Idiot, you are treason." "Herbert," Schmitz yelled even louder. "No, you are treason. You also betrayed God." You, His Majesty the Emperor." Mord Schmitz raised his saber again, his face pale and almost hysterical. "Get out of the way, Herbert." Schmitz also clenched the gun. "I'm ashamed of you." Another bullet was fired from the back of the queue, and the 2 cavalrymen next to Mort Schmitz instantly fell off their horses. The cavalry commander in the distance yelled anxiously, "Schmitz, kill him." As long as the last 2 infantrymen disappeared, the cavalrymen who followed could cut into the gap and then tear to both sides until all the poles were crushed. Mort Schmitz's knife seemed to be frozen. All he could hear was, "I'm ashamed of you." He didn't know whether he should be loyal to His Majesty the Emperor or listen to the voice of his conscience. The sound of horse hooves behind him gradually approached. Suddenly, there was a bang from the side and rear, and Herbert Schmitz's neck was torn open by a lead bullet and he fell on his back. "No, Mort." Schmitz turned his head and saw a cavalryman who had fallen off his horse before holding a carbine, with gunpowder still floating from the muzzle. His eyes turned blood red in an instant, and he turned his horse's head and rushed towards the guy. At the moment when the tip of the knife was about to pierce the cavalryman who fired the gun, he suddenly closed his eyes and let the saber fall to the ground. In just this slow time, Victor had led his men to the gap in the queue, and dozens of bayonets were pointing forward at the same time. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.